The Last Sermon. The Last Sermon. The morning fog clung to Kodiak Island like a shroud, rolling in from the Gulf of Alaska with the persistence of something alive and hungry. Reverend Charles Franklin Bennett stood at the window of his modest parsonage, watching the gray tendrils swirl around the towering spruce trees that surrounded St. Paul's Chapel. At 68, Charles had weathered 43 Alaskan winters. But something about this December 1st morning felt different. The air carried a weight that pressed against his chest, and the usual symphony of morning birds was conspicuously absent. Charles Bennett had arrived in Kodiak in 1981, a young seminary graduate from Minnesota with fire in his belly and salvation on his lips. Back then, his hair was the color of wheat, and his shoulders broad enough to carry the burdens of his flock. Now, silver-haired and stooped, he moved with the careful precision of a man whose body reminded him daily of his mortality. His congregation at St. Paul's had dwindled over the decades as young families migrated to Anchorage for work, leaving behind the elderly, the stubborn, and the deeply rooted. But Charles remained as much a fixture of Kodiak as the Russian Orthodox crosses that dotted the island's Orthodox churches. The chapel itself was a modest structure built in 1923 by Norwegian fishermen who needed God as much as they needed the sea. White clapboard siding, weathered to a pale grey, stretched up to a simple bell tower that housed a bronze bell cast in Seattle. 23 wooden steps led from the gravel parking area to the double oak doors, each step worn smooth by decades of faithful feet. The building sat on a slight rise overlooking Chiniak Bay, surrounded by a grove of ancient Sitka spruce that created a natural cathedral of their own. On this particular morning, Charles had risen early to prepare for the weekly food distribution that St. Paul's hosted every Sunday after the 10 a.m. service. Martha Kowalski, his stalwart volunteer coordinator, would arrive at 8 with her team of 4 other women. All of them past retirement age, but possessed of the kind of determination that had built Alaska. Together, they would arrange tables in the fellowship hall and sort through donations from the Kodiak Island Food Bank, canned goods, dried pasta, frozen fish from the local processing plants, and whatever vegetables the island's small farms could provide in December. Martha herself was a force of nature at 72, standing barely 5 feet tall, but commanding respect from dockworkers and city councilmen alike. Born Martha Volkov to Russian Orthodox parents, she had converted to Protestantism when she married Polish immigrant Jan Kowalski in 1973. Jan had been dead for 8 years now, claimed by lung cancer from decades of working the canneries. But Martha carried on their shared mission of feeding the hungry with the same intensity she had once brought to raising their 4 children. The other volunteers were equally devoted. Sarah Chen, 65, had moved to Kodiak from San Francisco in 1995 when her late husband took a job with the Coast Guard. Despite losing Robert to a fishing accident in 2018, she had remained on the island, finding purpose in service. Dorothy Engelhardt, 78, was the unofficial island historian, her German ancestry tracing back to the early 1900s, when her grandfather came to work the Fox Island fox farms. Elena Vasquez, 71, had arrived as a young bride from the Philippines in 1974 and had never left, raising 6 children who were now scattered across the lower 48. Finally, there was Agnes Thompson, 81, the oldest member of their group and the most stubborn. Agnes had been born on Kodiak, witnessed the 1964 tsunami, and declared she would die on Kodiak soil. Charles checked his watch. 6:47 a.m. The women would begin arriving in just over an hour, and he wanted to have the coffee brewing and the fellowship hall unlocked before they started hauling boxes. He pulled on his heavy wool coat, a gift from his late wife Eleanor, who had died 3 years ago from pancreatic cancer, and stepped into the pre-dawn darkness. The cold hit him immediately, a dry bite that made his sinuses ache. The thermometer on his porch read 18 degrees Fahrenheit, typical for early December, but still enough to make his arthritis flare in his left knee. Charles had learned to read the island's moods through decades of experience. This morning felt charged, electric in a way that reminded him of the moments before violent storms. The aurora borealis had been particularly active the night before, painting the sky in sheets of green and gold that seemed to pulse with their own heartbeat. As he crunched across the frost-covered gravel toward the chapel, Charles noticed the tracks, large round impressions in the snow that had fallen 2 days earlier, each print showing 4 distinct toe marks and what looked like claw indentations. The tracks were fresh, the snow inside them loose and powdery rather than the compressed ice of older prints. They led from the tree line, crossed the church parking area, and disappeared around the building's eastern side. Charles paused, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. Black bears were common on Kodiak, but these tracks were enormous, easily twice the size of any black bear print he had seen. The spacing between them suggested an animal of massive proportions, something that moved with the confident gait of an apex predator. More troubling was their direction. The tracks didn't meander like those of a foraging bear, but moved with purpose, as if the animal had been investigating the building itself. Kodiak Island was home to the largest brown bears in the world, genetic giants that could reach weights exceeding 1,500 pounds. These weren't the smaller grizzlies found in places like Yellowstone or Glacier National Park. Kodiak bears were a subspecies unto themselves, isolated for thousands of years, and evolved to take advantage of the island's rich salmon runs and abundant vegetation. Male boars in particular grew to terrifying proportions, standing 4 feet at the shoulder and reaching 8 feet when reared on their hind legs. Local wildlife biologist Dr. Amanda Foster had given a presentation to the community just 6 months earlier about increasing bear encounters around populated areas. Food sources were changing, she had explained, as climate variations affected salmon runs and berry crops. Bears were being forced to expand their ranges, venturing closer to human settlements in search of sustenance. She had shown slides of property damage, overturned dumpsters, and the aftermath of encounters that had ended badly for both humans and bears. Charles remembered her words clearly. A hungry bear is a dangerous bear, but a curious bear investigating human structures can be even more unpredictable. They're intelligent animals, problem solvers. Once they associate human buildings with potential food sources, they become persistent visitors. The tracks around St. Paul's Chapel suggested exactly this kind of investigation. Charles followed them with his eyes, noting how they circled the building before focusing on the area near the kitchen entrance. The church's modest food pantry was located in the basement, accessible through a set of concrete steps that led to a steel door. Could the bear have smelled the stored goods through the building's aging foundation? Charles pulled his cell phone from his coat pocket and considered calling the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. The local wildlife trooper, Officer Michael Brennan, had emphasized during community meetings that any signs of bears investigating human structures should be reported immediately. But it was not yet 7 in the morning, and the tracks were from the night before. The bear was likely long gone, returned to the dense forest that covered most of Kodiak's 3,600 square miles. Instead, Charles decided to conduct his own careful inspection. He followed the tracks around the building's perimeter, noting how they lingered near the fellowship hall's windows. The bear had stood on its hind legs here. Charles could see the scratches in the wooden siding where massive claws had scraped the paint. The animal had been tall enough to peer through windows that sat 8 feet off the ground. The discovery sent a chill through Charles that had nothing to do with the morning cold. This was not random foraging behavior. The bear had conducted a systematic investigation of the church building, testing multiple access points and gathering information about the structure's layout. Dr. Foster had mentioned this kind of behavior during her presentation, intelligent reconnaissance that preceded more aggressive attempts to access food sources. Charles completed his circuit of the building and returned to the front steps. The tracks here were more numerous and complex, with what appeared to be multiple visits to the same spots. The bear had spent considerable time at the base of the wooden steps, and Charles could see where its claws had gouged deep marks in the handrail's support posts. More disturbing were the additional tracks he found. These appeared to be from a second, smaller bear. Based on their size and the stride pattern, Dr. Foster would likely identify them as belonging to a sub-adult, possibly a 3- or 4-year-old that had recently separated from its mother. Two bears, both investigating the church with apparent interest in the building itself, rather than just passing through the area. Charles felt his stomach tighten with a worry that went beyond simple concern for property damage. Sunday mornings brought his entire congregation to this building, 23 regular attendees, plus another dozen or so who came specifically for the food distribution. Most were elderly, several used walkers or wheelchairs, and none would be able to move quickly if confronted by aggressive wildlife. The Kodiak Island brown bear population was estimated at approximately 3,500 individuals, making it one of the densest bear populations in North America. During salmon season, it was not uncommon to see dozens of bears concentrated around spawning streams, fishing with a tolerance for proximity that amazed visitors. But December was different. Salmon runs had ended months ago, berries were long gone, and the bears should have been entering their winter dormancy phase. Should have been. But climate patterns had been unusual for the past several years, with warmer temperatures extending the active season and disrupting traditional hibernation cycles. Dr. Foster had documented cases of bears remaining active well into December and even January, forced to continue foraging when their biological systems should have been shutting down for winter. Charles pulled out his phone again, and this time dialed Officer Brennan's number. The call went directly to voicemail. "Mike, this is Charles Bennett at St. Paul's Chapel. I've found some concerning bear tracks around the church building. Looks like systematic investigation rather than casual foraging. Large prints, possibly 2 animals. We have our weekly food distribution this morning starting at 9. Please call me back when you get this message." He pocketed the phone and continued toward the chapel's main entrance. The lock on the heavy oak doors was old but solid, installed by Charles himself 15 years earlier after a break-in that had netted thieves $200 from the collection plate and a bottle of communion wine. His hands were stiff with cold as he worked the key, and he noticed that his fingers were trembling slightly. Whether from the temperature or mounting anxiety, he couldn't be sure. The interior of St. Paul's Chapel embraced him with its familiar warmth and the scent of lemon oil used to polish the wooden pews. 12 rows of benches faced a simple altar, topped with a wooden cross that Charles's predecessor had carved from driftwood found on Passachuck Beach. Morning light filtered through stained glass windows depicting scenes from the Gospels, casting jeweled patterns across the worn wooden floors. Charles moved through his Sunday morning routine with practiced efficiency, but his mind kept returning to the tracks outside. He switched on the overhead lights, adjusted the thermostat to bring the sanctuary up to a comfortable temperature, and arranged his sermon notes on the pulpit. Today's message was taken from Matthew 25:35. "I was a stranger and you invited me in," chosen to complement the food distribution and emphasize the Christian duty of hospitality to those in need. The fellowship hall occupied the building's eastern wing, a multi-purpose space that served for everything from church dinners to community meetings. Charles unlocked the connecting door and began arranging the folding tables and chairs that Martha's team would need for sorting donations. The work was familiar and soothing, allowing him to focus on something tangible rather than dwelling on hypothetical dangers lurking in the forest. By 8 o'clock, Charles had completed his preparations and returned to the parsonage to shower and dress for the service. He selected his best suit, navy blue with a subtle pinstripe that Eleanor had chosen for his 60th birthday, and his favorite tie, a deep burgundy silk that complemented his still thick silver hair. Appearance mattered to Charles, not from vanity, but from respect for his calling and his congregation. These people deserved a pastor who took his responsibilities seriously, who dressed with dignity befitting the Word of God. Martha Kowalski arrived precisely at 8:15, her ancient Ford pickup truck loaded with boxes and her team of volunteers. Charles watched from his kitchen window as the women began unloading supplies with military efficiency. Martha directed the operation like a general deploying troops, her voice carrying clearly across the parking area despite her small stature. Sarah, take the canned goods directly to table 3. Dorothy, you're on produce sorting. Remember to check everything for spoilage. Eleanor, handle the frozen items and get them into the hall freezer immediately. Agnes, you're with me on registration and check in. Charles smiled at the familiar choreography. These women had been working together for over a decade, and their system was refined to clockwork precision. Families in need could arrive, register discreetly, and leave with bags of groceries without feeling like objects of charity. Martha insisted on maintaining dignity in the process, understanding that many of their clients were proud people who had fallen on temporary hard times. The morning proceeded normally until 8:45, when Dorothy Englehart's scream pierced the crisp air like a knife blade. Charles dropped his coffee cup and ran outside without grabbing his coat, reaching the parking area just as Dorothy backed away from the fellowship hall's side window, her face white with terror. "There's something looking in the window," she gasped, pointing with a shaking hand toward the building's eastern wall. "Something huge with eyes." Martha immediately took charge, herding the women toward the center of the parking area while Charles approached the window Dorothy had indicated. The fellowship hall's windows sat at ground level, offering easy viewing for anyone or anything standing outside. Charles moved carefully, scanning the tree line for movement. At first he saw nothing unusual. The dense spruce forest began just 20 yards from the building, creating a wall of dark green that could conceal almost anything. Then, as his eyes adjusted to the shadows beneath the trees, Charles saw it. A massive brown shape, motionless among the trunks, watching the building with the patient intensity of a predator studying prey. The bear was enormous, even at a distance. Its head appeared to be the size of a barrel, and its shoulders showed the distinctive muscle mass of a mature male Kodiak brown bear. The animal stood perfectly still, only its small, dark eyes moving as it tracked the humans in the parking area. There was something deeply unsettling about its behavior, not the nervous energy of a bear accidentally encountering humans, but the calculated observation of an animal that had made a deliberate choice to be here. "Everyone stay calm and move slowly toward the chapel," Charles called out, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "Martha, call 911 and ask for fish and game. Tell them we have a large brown bear showing interest in our building." The women responded with the kind of controlled urgency that came from living in bear country. No one ran or made sudden movements, but they covered the distance to the chapel's front steps with purposeful haste. Agnes Thompson, despite her 81 years, climbed the steps with surprising agility, while Eleanor Vasquez helped Sarah Chen, who had developed mobility issues since her husband's death. Charles remained outside, keeping himself between the bear and his volunteers while Martha made the emergency call. The bear continued its motionless observation, giving no indication that it intended to leave or approach closer. Charles estimated its weight at well over 1,000 pounds, possibly approaching the 1,500-pound maximum that the largest Kodiak boars could achieve. Its winter coat was thick and lustrous, suggesting excellent health and abundant food resources throughout the previous months. "Fish and Game is sending Officer Brennan," Martha reported from the chapel steps. "He's about 20 minutes out. They want us to stay inside until he arrives." Charles nodded but remained in position, unwilling to turn his back on the bear. In his 4 decades on Kodiak, he had encountered bears dozens of times, usually while hiking or fishing in the island's remote areas. Standard protocol was simple. Make yourself appear large, back away slowly, avoid direct eye contact, and speak in calm, steady tones. Never run unless absolutely certain you could reach safety, because bears could sprint at 35 miles per hour and climb faster than any human. But this situation felt different from previous encounters. The bear showed none of the typical behaviors Charles had learned to expect. It wasn't foraging, investigating garbage, or moving through the area to reach another destination. Instead, it maintained its position with the patience of an animal engaged in deliberate surveillance. Its body language suggested confidence rather than caution, as if it had already determined that these humans posed no threat to its presence. Dr. Amanda Foster had explained during her community presentation that Kodiak bears possessed intelligence comparable to that of great apes. They could recognize individual humans, remember locations where they had found food, and develop complex strategies for accessing desired resources. Adult males, in particular, showed problem-solving abilities that often surprised researchers. They could manipulate simple mechanisms, understand cause and effect relationships, and adapt their behavior based on previous experiences. The bear watching St. Paul's Chapel demonstrated exactly this kind of calculated intelligence. Charles could see it processing information, cataloging details about the building's layout, the number of humans present, and potential access points. The animal's nose was constantly in motion, sampling the air for scents that might indicate food sources. With its acute sense of smell, 7 times more sensitive than that of a bloodhound, the bear could undoubtedly detect the food stored in the fellowship hall. Minutes passed like hours as Charles maintained his vigil. The bear remained motionless, a brown statue that seemed carved from the forest itself. Then, at precisely 9 o'clock, it simply melted back into the trees. One moment it was there, a massive presence impossible to ignore, and the next it had vanished among the spruce trunks as silently as morning mist. Charles waited another 5 minutes before retreating to the chapel, where he found the volunteers clustered in the sanctuary's front pews. Their faces showed the mixture of excitement and fear that followed close encounters with Kodiak's apex predators. Dorothy was still pale, her hands shaking as Martha pressed a cup of hot coffee into her palms. "I've never seen one that big," Dorothy whispered. "It was like looking at a small truck with fur." "My grandfather used to tell stories about bears like that," Agnes added, her voice carrying the authority of 8 decades on the island. "He called them the Old Ones, the bears that had learned to fear nothing because nothing on the island could challenge them. Said they were smart enough to open doors and strong enough to tear down walls." Charles felt a chill that had nothing to do with the December morning. Agnes Thompson's grandfather had been Alexander Thompson, one of Kodiak's earliest permanent settlers, and a man whose stories about the island's wildlife had achieved legendary status. Alexander had claimed that certain bears, always mature males of exceptional size, developed behaviors that went beyond typical wildlife patterns. They became, in his words, students of human behavior, learning to predict and exploit human routines. Officer Michael Brennan arrived at 9:20, his green fish and game truck crunching across the gravel parking area. Brennan was a compact man in his 40s, with the kind of practical competence that came from 20 years of dealing with Alaska's wildlife challenges. He had grown up in Kodiak, left for college in Fairbanks, and returned with a degree in wildlife biology and a determination to protect both animals and humans from each other. Charles met him in the parking area and provided a detailed account of the morning's events. Brennan listened with professional attention, taking notes in a small notebook while examining the tracks that remained visible in the protected areas of snow. Definitely a large boar, Brennan confirmed after completing his investigation. Based on the size and depth of these prints, I'd estimate 12 to 1,500 pounds. The behavior you describe is concerning. Systematic investigation of human structures suggests food conditioning or territorial establishment. Food conditioning, Charles asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. When bears learn to associate human buildings or activities with food sources, once that connection is established, they become persistent visitors. The problem is that their idea of accessing food doesn't account for doors, walls, or property rights. A bear this size could go through the side of your building like it was paper. Brennan continued his examination, taking photographs of the tracks and claw marks. What's especially troubling is the methodical nature of this investigation. Random bears passing through might leave a few tracks, but this animal spent significant time studying your building. It knows this is a food storage location now. What do you recommend? Charles asked, though he dreaded the answer. Cancel today's food distribution. In fact, I'd recommend suspending all food-related activities until we can address this situation. A bear of this size that's showing territorial behavior around a food source is an immediate public safety threat. Charles felt his heart sink. The food distribution wasn't just a community service. It was a lifeline for 20 to 30 families who depended on these weekly supplies to make ends meet. December was particularly challenging, with heating costs consuming most fixed incomes and seasonal work opportunities at their annual minimum. Cancelling the distribution would mean real hardship for people who were already struggling. How long would such a suspension last? Charles asked. That depends on the bear's behavior over the next few days. If it moves on to other areas, we might be able to resume activities within a week or two. But if it establishes this location as part of its regular territory, we're looking at a much longer disruption. Brennan's radio crackled with static, and he stepped away to respond to a call from his dispatcher. Charles could hear fragments of the conversation, something about another bear sighting near the Kodiak High School, requests for additional personnel, and coordination with the city police department. We've got multiple sightings across town this morning, Brennan explained when he returned. 3 different bears, all showing unusual behavior patterns. Something's got them active and mobile when they should be denning for winter. The implications were troubling. Kodiak's human population of just over 13,000 people shared the island with an estimated 3,500 brown bears. Peaceful coexistence depended on maintaining clear boundaries between human and bear territories. When those boundaries broke down, conflicts escalated quickly and rarely ended well for either species. Charles made the difficult decision to cancel the food distribution, but he refused to cancel the regular Sunday service. His congregation needed their weekly gathering now more than ever, especially with the additional stress of knowing that large predators were actively investigating their community spaces. Faith, Charles believed, was most important during times of uncertainty and fear. Martha Kowalski disagreed vehemently. Charles, you're being foolish. That bear could return at any time, and you're talking about having elderly people climb those front steps with a 1,500-pound predator somewhere in the woods. Officer Brennan will maintain surveillance during the service, Charles replied, though Brennan had made no such commitment. And bears typically avoid areas with human activity during daylight hours. Typically, Martha repeated with heavy emphasis, but this morning's behavior was anything but typical. The debate continued for another 10 minutes before Charles exercised his pastoral authority and declared the service would proceed as scheduled. Martha's team began repacking the food distribution supplies with obvious reluctance, muttering among themselves about stubborn pastors and unnecessary risks. By 9:45, the first congregants began arriving for the 10 o'clock service. Charles stood at the chapel's front doors to greet each person individually, a tradition he had maintained for over 20 years. Today, however, his welcoming smile was strained, and his eyes constantly scanned the tree line for any sign of movement. Frank Peterson arrived first, as he had every Sunday for the past 8 years. Frank was 74, a retired commercial fisherman who walked with a pronounced limp from a deck accident in 1998. His wife, Betty, followed slowly behind, using her aluminum walker to navigate the uneven gravel. Betty had Parkinson's disease, diagnosed 3 years earlier, and her condition had deteriorated noticeably in recent months. "Morning, Pastor," Frank said, shaking Charles's hand with fingers that were permanently stained by decades of handling fishing nets. "Heard there was some excitement earlier. Martha called Betty about cancelling the food drive." "Just a precautionary measure," Charles replied, helping Betty navigate the steps. "Officer Brennan is handling the situation." Robert and Linda Johansson arrived next, a couple in their late 60s who had moved to Kodiak from Oregon when Robert retired from the Postal Service. They were followed by the Volkov family, 3 generations of Russian Orthodox descendants who had converted to Protestantism in the 1980s but maintained many of their cultural traditions. Patriarch Dmitry Volkov, 87, was one of the few people on the island who remembered the World War II evacuation, when all civilian residents were forced to relocate to southeastern Alaska for their safety. The congregation that gathered that morning represented the heart of Kodiak's aging population. Mary Patterson, 92, had to be helped up the steps by her grandson James, who had driven in from his fishing boat moored in the harbour. Patricia Williams, 78, moved slowly with her oxygen tank, suffering from chronic obstructive pulmonary disease caused by decades of second-hand smoke from her late husband's cigarettes. David and Joan Murphy, both in their early 70s, had recently lost their son in a fishing accident and found comfort in Charles's weekly messages of hope and redemption. Each person climbed the 23 steps to the chapel's entrance, unaware that somewhere in the surrounding forest, intelligent eyes might be watching their progress. Charles maintained his position at the doors, greeting each congregant, while continuously scanning the perimeter for any sign of the bear's return. The service began at 10 o'clock sharp, as it had every Sunday for the past 43 years. Charles delivered his sermon on Christian hospitality with particular passion, drawing parallels between the biblical call to welcome strangers and the community's response to those struggling with hunger and poverty. His voice carried the authority of decades in the pulpit, but those who knew him well noticed the tension in his shoulders and the way his eyes occasionally drifted toward the windows. At 10:53, just as Charles was beginning the closing prayer, the attack began. The first sign was a sound like thunder, a deep rumbling that seemed to emerge from the earth itself. The chapel's wooden structure transmitted the vibrations through the floor and walls, causing the stained glass windows to rattle in their frames. Then came the scratching, long, deliberate scrapes against the building's exterior that sounded like giant fingernails dragging across a chalkboard. Charles stopped mid-prayer, his voice dying in his throat as he processed what he was hearing. Several congregants opened their eyes and looked around nervously, but most remained in prayer position, assuming the sounds were caused by wind or settling building materials. The scratching stopped, replaced by a silence that seemed to press against the chapel walls. Charles could hear his own heartbeat and the shallow breathing of his congregation. Then, with no warning, the fellowship hall's door exploded inward. The bear, that entered St. Paul's Chapel was beyond anything Charles had imagined. Standing on its hind legs, it filled the doorway completely, its massive head brushing against the 8-foot ceiling. Its fur was dark brown, almost black in the indoor lighting, and its small eyes held an intelligence that was somehow more terrifying than blind rage would have been. The animal dropped to all fours and moved into the fellowship hall with surprising grace for something that weighed as much as a compact car. Its claws clicked against the linoleum floor, and Charles could smell its wild musk even from the sanctuary. The bear's nose was in constant motion, sampling the air and cataloguing every scent in the building. Panic erupted among the congregation. Mary Patterson's grandson, James, leaped to his feet and shouted, "Jesus Christ, it's a bear!" His voice broke the spell of shocked silence, and suddenly everyone was moving at once. Elderly congregants struggled to rise from pews, walkers and canes clattering against wooden benches, voices raised in fear and confusion. "Nobody move," Charles commanded, his pastoral voice cutting through the chaos. "Everyone remain seated and stay calm. Do not run." But it was too late for calm rationality. Patricia Williams had dropped her oxygen tank in her haste to stand, and the metallic clang as it struck the floor echoed through the sanctuary. The sound seemed to focus the bear's attention, and it began moving purposefully toward the connecting door between the fellowship hall and sanctuary. Charles positioned himself between the bear and his congregation, spreading his arms wide to make himself appear larger. Everything he had learned about bear safety screamed at him to back away, to put distance between himself and the predator. But 23 elderly people sat behind him, most of them physically incapable of rapid movement, and Charles would not abandon them. "Easy," he said in a firm, steady voice, making direct eye contact with the bear, despite every instinct telling him to look away. "Easy, big fellow. You don't want to be in here. This isn't the place for you." The bear paused at the doorway, its massive frame filling the opening between the two rooms. Up close, Charles could see details that would haunt him forever. The bear's teeth, yellow and worn, but still capable of crushing bone, the long, curved claws that clicked against the floor with each step, the incredible mass of muscle that moved beneath its thick winter coat. Most terrifying of all was the bear's demeanor. It showed no signs of agitation or fear, no defensive posturing or warning displays. Instead, it examined the sanctuary and its occupants with the calm assessment of an apex predator that had never known defeat. This was an animal that had lived 15 or 20 years without meeting anything it couldn't kill or drive away, and its confidence was absolute. "Charles, get away from there," Martha whispered urgently from somewhere behind him. "Come toward us slowly." But Charles remained in position, understanding instinctively that any movement might trigger the bear's predatory response. Behind him, he could hear the soft sounds of his congregation, attempting to remain motionless. The whisper of clothing against wooden pews, the rasp of Patricia Williams trying to breathe quietly without her oxygen, the muffled sob from Mary Patterson as she clutched her grandson's arm. The bear took a step into the sanctuary, then another. Each footfall caused the wooden floor to creak under its massive weight. Charles estimated that less than 15 feet now separated him from 1,200 pounds of perfectly evolved killing machine. He could see the bear's breath in the cool air, small puffs of vapor that testified to the animal's elevated metabolism and alertness. "Lord," Charles prayed silently, "if this is my time, please protect these people. Let this animal take me and spare the others." The bear stopped just inside the sanctuary and rose to its full height on its hind legs. Standing upright, it towered over Charles by more than 2 feet, its head nearly touching the ceiling's exposed wooden beams. From this position, it could see the entire congregation, could assess the threat level of each individual human, and determine the most efficient way to proceed. What happened next would be debated by wildlife experts for years to come. The bear, having completed its assessment, dropped back to all fours and began to circle the sanctuary's perimeter. It moved along the walls, investigating the stained glass windows and examining the wooden pews with apparent curiosity. Its behavior suggested not hunting, but exploration, as if it were conducting a detailed survey of the building's interior. Several congregants attempted to use this opportunity to move toward the exit, but Charles held up his hand to stop them. "Stay absolutely still," he whispered. "Let it investigate. Movement triggers hunting responses." The bear completed its circuit of the sanctuary and returned to the center aisle, where it sat back on its haunches and resumed its patient observation of the humans. Charles realized with growing horror that the animal was demonstrating classic territorial behavior. It had claimed the space and was now waiting to see how the humans would respond to its presence. Outside, the sound of approaching vehicles cut through the morning air. Officer Brennan's truck, followed by what sounded like additional emergency responders. Help was arriving, but Charles understood that rescue attempts could escalate the situation dangerously. Sudden noises, multiple human voices, and the stress of confrontation could transform the bear's current calm assessment into explosive violence. The bear's ears swiveled toward the sounds outside, and its posture shifted subtly. The relaxed curiosity was replaced by heightened alertness, and Charles could see the animal's muscles tensing beneath its thick coat. This was the moment of maximum danger, when external pressure might force the bear to make a decisive move regarding the humans trapped inside the sanctuary. Charles made a choice that would define the remaining moments of his life. Instead of waiting for rescue, instead of hoping the bear would simply leave, he began to move slowly toward the chapel's front doors. If he could draw the bear's attention away from his congregation, if he could become the primary focus of its interest, perhaps the others could escape during the confusion. "Charles, no!" Martha hissed from her pew, but he ignored her. Each step toward the doors required enormous willpower. Every instinct screamed at him to remain motionless, to avoid attracting the predator's attention. But Charles had spent 43 years learning to overcome his natural instincts in service of his calling. He had comforted the dying when everything in him wanted to flee from death's presence. He had confronted addiction and abuse when silence would have been easier. Now, approaching his 69th birthday, he would face his greatest test of faith and courage. The bear tracked his movement with its dark eyes, its massive head turning to follow Charles's progress across the sanctuary. When Charles reached the center aisle, the bear stood and took a step toward him. Then another. Its breathing had deepened, and Charles could hear the soft huffing sounds that wildlife experts identified as signs of increasing arousal in brown bears. "That's right," Charles said softly, continuing his slow retreat toward the doors. "Follow me. Leave them alone, and follow me." The strategy worked initially. The bear began moving up the center aisle, maintaining a distance of about 10 feet from Charles, but clearly focused on him rather than the congregation. Charles could feel the animal's presence like a physical weight, could sense the barely contained power in its massive frame. They reached the chapel's entrance together, man and bear moving in a grotesque parody of a wedding processional. Charles backed through the doorway onto the front steps, and the bear followed, emerging into the morning sunlight with its fur gleaming like polished wood. Outside, Officer Brennan had taken position behind his truck, his rifle raised and ready. 2 additional fish and game vehicles had arrived, along with a Kodiak Police Department unit and an ambulance. The parking area looked like a law enforcement convention, but Charles knew that all the weapons and trained personnel in Alaska couldn't guarantee a safe resolution to this confrontation. "Stay back," Charles called to the officers, his voice carrying across the parking area. "I'm going to try to lead it away from the building." What Charles couldn't see was the second bear. The sub-adult that had been tracking with the larger male had positioned itself in the trees on the building's western side, while everyone's attention focused on the dramatic confrontation at the front entrance. The younger bear moved through the forest with the stealth that only wild animals possess. It reached the Fellowship Hall's damaged door just as Charles and the large male emerged onto the front steps. Agnes Thompson was the first to see it. The 81-year-old woman had remained in her pew near the back of the sanctuary, unwilling to crowd toward the exit with the younger congregants. From her position, she had a clear view through the doorway into the Fellowship Hall, and she watched with growing horror as a second massive shape filled the space where the door had been. "There's another one," she whispered, but her voice was lost in the general confusion of people trying to decide whether to evacuate or remain hidden. The second bear was smaller than its companion, but still massive by any reasonable standard, probably 800 to 1,000 pounds and standing 6 feet at the shoulder. Its behavior was more agitated than the larger bear's calm assessment, suggesting a younger animal with less experience managing stress and uncertainty. Agnes Thompson made a decision that saved lives. Instead of whispering or remaining silent, she stood up in her pew and shouted with all the lung power her 81 years could muster, "Second bear in the Fellowship Hall, everyone to the altar." Her voice cut through the sanctuary like a fire alarm, galvanizing the congregation into immediate action. Years of living in bear country had taught them to trust such warnings without question or hesitation. Frank Peterson grabbed his wife Betty under the arms and half-carried her toward the altar area. Robert Johansson swept Mary Patterson into his arms, despite his own age and limitations. Within seconds, every mobile member of the congregation was moving toward the sanctuary's far end, where the altar area offered the only space with some distance from both doorways. The sudden movement and noise triggered exactly the response that wildlife experts most feared. The subadult bear in the Fellowship Hall roared, a sound like a diesel engine mixed with breaking glass, and charged into the sanctuary. Unlike its methodical companion, this bear moved with the explosive violence of an animal driven by stress and adrenaline. Charles, still positioned on the front steps with the larger bear, heard the roar and understood immediately what was happening. He turned to look back into the sanctuary just as the second bear bowled over 2 pews in its rush toward the fleeing congregants. The wooden benches splintered under its weight, sending fragments of pine flying across the room. In that moment of divided attention, the large male made its move. Charles felt, rather than saw the bear's approach, a sudden wall of fur and muscle that struck him from behind with the force of a freight train. He was airborne for perhaps 2 seconds before crashing into the gravel parking area, his Sunday suit tearing as he skidded across the rough surface. The bear was on him before he could even attempt to rise. Charles felt the animal's weight pressing down on him, crushing his chest and making breathing impossible. He could smell its wild musk, could feel the heat radiating from its massive body. Then came the pain, an explosion of agony as the bear's teeth closed around his shoulder, penetrating flesh and muscle to scrape against bone. Charles tried to scream, but could produce only a wet gasp. The bear shook him like a dog with a toy, his body ragdolling in the predator's jaws. He was vaguely aware of gunshots, Officer Brennan and his colleagues trying to get clear shots without hitting their target, but the sounds seemed to come from very far away. Inside the sanctuary, chaos reigned. The subadult bear had cornered most of the congregation near the altar, but its behavior was erratic rather than focused. It would charge toward the group, then veer away at the last moment, roaring and swatting at the air. Dorothy Engelhardt had fainted and lay crumpled between 2 pews. Patricia Williams had collapsed when her oxygen tank was damaged in the rush to escape, and she lay gasping for breath while David Murphy tried to provide assistance. Agnes Thompson, despite her advanced age, had positioned herself between the bear and the group's most vulnerable members. She held a heavy wooden cross, a gift from the chapel's founding members, and brandished it like a weapon while shouting at the animal in a mixture of English and the Russian phrases her grandmother had taught her decades earlier. "Get back, you devil! This is God's house! Get back!" The bear seemed momentarily confused by her aggressive stance. Most humans it encountered either fled or attempted to appear non-threatening. Agnes's territorial display challenged its understanding of typical human behavior, creating a moment of hesitation that allowed others to continue repositioning themselves. Outside, the attack on Charles continued with methodical brutality. The bear had released its initial bite and was now using its claws to rake across his back and legs, each swipe opening wounds that went down to the bone. Charles was conscious, but going into shock, his vision graying at the edges as blood loss and trauma overwhelmed his system. Officer Brennan finally achieved a clear shot and fired his rifle, a .300 Winchester Magnum loaded with 200 grain bullets designed specifically for stopping dangerous game. The shot struck the bear in the shoulder, penetrating deep into the muscle mass but missing vital organs. Instead of dropping the animal, the bullet served only to enrage it further. The wounded bear released Charles and reared up on its hind legs, roaring its fury at the assembled officers. Blood streamed from its shoulder wound, but the injury seemed to affect its mobility very little. Kodiak bears were renowned for their ability to absorb tremendous physical damage and continue fighting, their massive bone structure and thick muscle mass providing natural armor against most weapons. Brennan fired again, this shot striking the bear center mass and finally achieving the immediate incapacitation that the situation required. The animal dropped heavily, its great weight shaking the ground where it fell. But the damage was already done. Charles lay motionless in a spreading pool of blood, his body broken beyond any possibility of repair. The drama inside the sanctuary was far from over. The second bear had become increasingly agitated as the sounds of gunfire penetrated the building. Its stress responses were now completely triggered, and it began charging the group of congregants with serious intent to make contact. Frank Peterson made a heroic decision. Despite his age and physical limitations, he broke away from the group and began moving toward the fellowship hall, shouting and waving his arms to draw the bear's attention away from the others. The strategy worked, but at a terrible cost. The bear immediately focused on this new target and charged with explosive speed. Frank had perhaps 3 seconds to understand his mistake before 800 pounds of enraged predator struck him like a battering ram. He was thrown backward into the wooden pews with enough force to snap his spine, his body making a sound like breaking kindling as it impacted the church furniture. The bear stood over Frank's motionless form, huffing and swaying as it tried to process the sudden silence. The remaining congregants had pressed themselves against the sanctuary's far wall, creating as much distance as possible from the predator. Some were praying aloud, their voices creating a low murmur that seemed to calm the animal slightly. Agnes Thompson still held her wooden cross, but her defiant posture had given way to protective positioning around Patricia Williams, who was struggling to breathe without her damaged oxygen equipment. The old woman's eyes met the bear's gaze directly, and for a moment that lasted an eternity, human and animal studied each other across the blood-stained sanctuary. Outside, emergency responders were dealing with Charles's critical injuries, while simultaneously planning their approach to the bear still inside the building. Paramedic Jennifer Walsh, a 20-year veteran of Alaska's emergency medical services, worked frantically to stabilize Charles's condition. The damage was extensive. Massive blood loss from multiple lacerations, probable internal injuries from the bear's weight, and signs of severe shock that indicated his body's systems were beginning to shut down. "We need to get him to the hospital immediately," Walsh told Officer Brennan. but I can't transport until that building is secured. If the bear comes back out while we're loading him, we'll have multiple casualties." Brennan was coordinating with his backup officers and trying to establish communication with the people trapped inside the sanctuary. His radio crackled with updates from other bear encounters across town, painting a picture of multiple animals engaged in unprecedented aggressive behavior. Something had disrupted the island's bear population, driving them into human-populated areas with an urgency that wildlife experts had never documented. Dr. Amanda Foster arrived at the scene at 11:20, her emergency response kit containing tranquilizer equipment and specialized knowledge about bear behavior. She immediately began assessing the situation from a wildlife management perspective, trying to understand what had triggered such unusual aggression in multiple animals simultaneously. "This isn't normal territorial behavior," she explained to Brennan as they watched the chapel from behind the safety of an armored fish and game vehicle. Brown bears at this time of year should be denning, or at least moving toward denning sites. Multiple aggressive encounters suggest environmental pressure or food shortage that's forcing them into survival mode. Inside the sanctuary, the standoff continued. The bear had not moved for nearly 10 minutes, but its presence filled the space with tension that made breathing difficult. Several congregants were showing signs of stress-related medical issues. David Murphy was clutching his chest and breathing heavily, suggesting possible cardiac stress. Joan Murphy was hyperventilating, and Mary Patterson appeared to be losing consciousness in her grandson James's arms. Agnes Thompson made another decision that demonstrated the kind of courage that had built Alaska's communities. She began to pray aloud, her voice strong and clear in the silence. "Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name." One by one, other voices joined hers. Betty Peterson, despite her husband's motionless form just yards away, added her trembling voice to the prayer. Patricia Williams, struggling for breath, whispered the familiar words. Even James Patterson, who had declared himself agnostic since his discharge from the army, found himself speaking along with the group. The bear's reaction to the communal prayer was unexpected. Instead of being agitated by the human voices, it seemed to calm slightly. Its breathing slowed, and its aggressive posture relaxed into something closer to curiosity. Dr. Foster, observing from outside, would later theorize that the rhythmic, non-threatening nature of the group vocalization triggered the bear's recognition of non-aggressive behavior. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," the voices continued, growing stronger as more congregants found the courage to participate. Agnes Thompson had moved on from the Lord's Prayer to the 23rd Psalm, choosing words that seemed appropriate for their circumstances. "He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He guideth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake." The bear began to move again, but slowly and without apparent aggressive intent. It walked to the center of the sanctuary and sat down heavily, facing the group of humans who continued their recitation. Its ears were forward rather than back, indicating attention rather than aggression. For several minutes, the extraordinary scene continued. 20 elderly humans reciting scripture while a 1,000-pound predator listened with apparent interest. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me." Dr. Foster later noted that this portion of the psalm seemed to have particular resonance. The bear's body language became noticeably more relaxed, and it began the grooming behaviors that indicated reduced stress levels. It licked its paws and used them to clean its face, typical actions for bears transitioning from high alert to normal activity. The crisis ended as unexpectedly as it had begun. At 11:47, the bear simply stood up, walked back through the fellowship hall, and exited through the damaged door. Emergency responders watching from outside observed it moving purposefully into the forest without looking back or showing any interest in the human activity around the building. Charles Bennett was airlifted to Providence Kodiak Island Medical Center at 12:15, but he died during surgery at 2:37 that afternoon. The massive trauma to his chest and abdomen, combined with blood loss and shock, proved too severe for even the skilled trauma team to overcome. His last words, spoken to paramedic Jennifer Walsh during transport, were, "Tell them the bear wasn't evil. It was just trying to survive." Frank Peterson survived his injuries, but would never walk again. The impact with the pews had compressed 3 vertebrae and damaged his spinal cord in ways that modern medicine could not repair. He spent the remaining 2 years of his life in a wheelchair, telling anyone who would listen that he regretted nothing about his decision to draw the bear's attention away from the other congregants. The investigation that followed revealed troubling details about the circumstances leading to the attack. Wildlife cameras installed around the island as part of Dr. Foster's research project showed unusual bear movement patterns beginning in mid-November. Multiple large males had been traveling outside their normal territories, often moving at night and showing persistent interest in human structures. Food source analysis revealed the underlying cause. An unusually warm autumn had delayed the formation of ice on salmon-spawning streams, disrupting the bear's final feeding opportunities before winter dormancy. Simultaneously, a fungal disease had affected the island's berry crops, eliminating another crucial food source. The bears were entering winter with insufficient fat reserves, forcing them to continue foraging when they should have been denning. The specific trigger for the December 1st attacks remained unclear, but Dr. Foster developed a theory based on scent trail analysis. The large male that killed Charles Bennett had been following the scent traces of food preparation that emanated from St. Paul's Chapel. The weekly food distributions had created a consistent pattern of human activity and food concentration that the bear had learned to monitor. When the distribution was cancelled that morning, but the building remained occupied, it may have created confusion that prompted closer investigation. Dr. Foster's post-incident report included recommendations that would change wildlife management protocols across Alaska. When intelligent predators learn to associate specific human structures with food resources, standard deterrent methods become inadequate. These animals are capable of complex behavioral modification based on observed patterns. They learn our schedules, our routines, and our vulnerabilities. The attack also revealed gaps in Kodiak's emergency response capabilities. Despite the island's large bear population and history of human-wildlife conflicts, there was no established protocol for managing multiple aggressive animals simultaneously. Radio communication between agencies was inadequate, and specialized equipment for safely immobilizing large bears was limited. City officials implemented immediate changes following the incident. All food distribution operations were moved to the Civic Center, which offered better security and multiple exit routes. Church and community organizations were required to install bear-proof storage containers for any food-related activities. A new early warning system was established, using wildlife cameras and radio networks to track bear movements near populated areas. The psychological impact on survivors was profound and lasting. Martha Kowalski never returned to St. Paul's Chapel, unable to enter the building where she had witnessed Charles's death and come so close to losing her own life. Dorothy Engelhardt developed severe anxiety that manifested as an inability to go outdoors alone, even in urban areas far from bear habitat. Sarah Chen moved back to San Francisco within 6 months, telling friends that she could no longer find peace on an island where death could emerge from the forest without warning. Agnes Thompson, despite her advanced age, showed remarkable resilience. She continued attending services at St. Paul's Chapel, now led by a young pastor named David Williams, who had volunteered to complete Charles's ministry. Agnes insisted on sitting in the same pew she had occupied during the attack, claiming that fear had no place in God's house. When asked about her courage during the confrontation, she simply said, "I was too old to run and too stubborn to quit praying." The chapel itself bore permanent scars from that December morning. The fellowship hall door was replaced with reinforced steel, and new windows were installed with security glass designed to withstand impact. But the deeper damage, the knowledge that their sacred space had been violated by forces beyond human control, proved impossible to repair. Attendance at St. Paul's Chapel dropped to fewer than a dozen regular congregants. The weekly food distribution was relocated permanently, and many community activities moved to other venues. The building that had served Kodiak's spiritual needs for over a century became a monument to the fragile nature of human safety in Alaska's wilderness. Media coverage of the incident spread far beyond Alaska's borders. National news networks sent reporters to Kodiak, drawn by the dramatic story of faith confronting nature's raw power. The image of Reverend Bennett's blood-stained suit jacket, photographed where it lay in the chapel parking area, became an iconic representation of humanity's vulnerability in the face of wild Alaska's apex predators. Wildlife documentary filmmaker Marcus Hoffman arrived on Kodiak 3 weeks after the attack to begin production on When Faith Meets Fear, the Kodiak Chapel incident. His crew spent 4 months on the island, interviewing survivors, studying bear behavior with Dr. Foster, and examining the broader implications of climate change on predator-prey relationships. What happened at St. Paul's Chapel was a perfect storm of environmental factors, animal behavior, and human activity, Hoffman explained in his documentary's narration. But it was also a story about the price of compassion. Reverend Bennett died because he refused to abandon his congregation. Frank Peterson was paralyzed because he chose to protect others rather than himself. These were not accidents or bad luck. They were the consequences of moral courage in the face of mortal danger. The documentary's most powerful segment featured Agnes Thompson returning to the sanctuary 6 months after the attack. The 81-year-old woman walked slowly down the center aisle, her cane tapping against the wooden floor that had been refinished to eliminate bloodstains. She stopped at the spot where the large male bear had sat and watched the congregation's prayer, and she spoke directly to the camera. "People ask me if I'm afraid to be here, if I think about that morning every time I walk through these doors. Of course I do. But fear isn't the enemy of faith. Fear is what makes faith necessary." Charles Bennett understood that. He died so that 22 other people could live, and that's what pastors do. They stand between their flock and whatever wants to destroy it, even when that something weighs 1,500 pounds and has claws like knives. The legal aftermath of the incident was complex and unprecedented. Charles Bennett's family, led by his daughter Rebecca Bennett Morrison from Seattle, filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the state of Alaska, alleging inadequate wildlife management and insufficient public safety measures. The suit claimed that fish and game officials had known about unusual bear behavior patterns, but failed to warn communities or take preventive action. State attorneys argued that bear attacks were an inherent risk of living in Alaska, and that government agencies could not be held responsible for the actions of wild animals. The case eventually settled out of court for an undisclosed amount, but it established legal precedents for municipal liability in wildlife management situations. More significantly, the incident prompted legislative action at the state level. The Alaska legislature passed the Bennett-Peterson Wildlife Safety Act in 2025, requiring enhanced bear monitoring systems, mandatory safety protocols for food-related community activities, and increased funding for emergency response training in rural communities. Dr. Amanda Foster's career was transformed by her investigation of the Chapel incident. Her detailed analysis of the bear's behavior patterns led to a research position at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, where she developed new protocols for predicting and preventing aggressive wildlife encounters. Her paper, Cognitive Adaptation in Large Predators, Evidence from the Kodiak Chapel Incident, became required reading in wildlife management programs across North America. What we learned from studying these bears is that they're capable of much more sophisticated behavior than we previously understood, Dr. Foster explained during a conference presentation 2 years later. They can learn human schedules, predict our activities, and develop strategies for accessing resources that demonstrate genuine problem-solving intelligence. This makes them both more dangerous and more fascinating than we ever realized. The larger male bear responsible for Charles's death was eventually tracked and killed 3 days after the attack. It was found 2 miles from the chapel, denned beneath a massive windfall where it had apparently intended to spend the winter. Examination of its stomach contents revealed an unusual diet that included garbage, pet food, and other human-provided nutrition sources. The animal had become dependent on human-related food sources and had lost its natural fear of people. The subadult bear disappeared into Kodiak's vast wilderness and was never conclusively identified again. Wildlife cameras occasionally captured images of a large brown bear in the chapel area over the following months, but whether this was the same animal remained unknown. Dr. Foster suspected that the younger bear had learned from the incident and would avoid human contact for the remainder of its life. St. Paul's Chapel struggled to maintain its ministry in the months following the attack. Interim pastor David Williams, a 28-year-old seminary graduate from Oregon, found himself leading a congregation haunted by trauma and fear. Attendance remained low, donations decreased, and many longtime members found excuses to worship elsewhere. Williams implemented new safety protocols that reflected the reality of ministering in bear country. Services were shortened to minimize time spent in the building. All windows were kept covered during gatherings to avoid creating visual stimuli that might attract wildlife attention. A new emergency communication system was installed, with direct connections to fish and game dispatch and medical services. But the most significant change was philosophical rather than practical. Williams's sermons began to address themes that Charles Bennett had rarely touched: the reality of evil in God's creation, the role of suffering in spiritual development, and the difficult balance between faith and prudence. These were harder messages than Charles's hopeful homilies about Christian love and community service. God doesn't promise us safety, Williams preached on the first anniversary of the attack. He promises us purpose. Charles Bennett found his purpose in those final moments when he chose to protect others rather than himself. Frank Peterson found his purpose when he drew danger away from the vulnerable. These men didn't die because God abandoned them. They died because they chose to embody God's love, even when it meant personal sacrifice. The anniversary service was attended by nearly 100 people, including many who had not set foot in St. Paul's Chapel since the attack. Rebecca Bennett Morrison came from Seattle with her 2 teenage children, wanting them to see the place where their grandfather had made his final stand. Frank Peterson attended in his wheelchair, accompanied by his wife Betty, whose Parkinson's disease had progressed significantly since that traumatic morning. Most surprisingly, representatives from Kodiak's other churches attended the service, setting aside denominational differences to honor the memory of a man who had died protecting his flock. Father Alexei Volkov, from the Russian Orthodox Cathedral, delivered a blessing in both English and Church Slavonic, while Pastor Eric Hansen, from the Lutheran Church, read from the Book of Common Prayer. The service concluded with the unveiling of a memorial plaque installed near the chapel's front steps. Made from Alaskan jade and bronze, it bore a simple inscription: Reverend Charles Franklin Bennett, 1956 to 2024, the Good Shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. John 10:11. As the congregation filed out after the ceremony, Agnes Thompson lingered at the memorial. At 82, she moved even more slowly than she had a year earlier, but her determination remained undiminished. She traced the letters of Charles's name with one gnarled finger and spoke softly to the morning air. You kept your promise, Charles. You protected us all. Rest in peace, dear friend. A light snow had begun to fall, dusting the memorial and the steps where Charles had made his final stand. In the distance, the forest stood silent and dark, holding secrets that would never be fully understood. Somewhere among those trees, bears continued their ancient patterns of survival, adapting to a world where human presence was both opportunity and threat. The story of St. Paul's Chapel had become part of Kodiak Island's collective memory, a reminder that in Alaska, civilization was always temporary and wilderness was eternal. The morning fog rolled in from the Gulf of Alaska, as it had for thousands of years before humans ever set foot on the island, and as it would continue long after the last church bell had fallen silent. But for those who had witnessed Charles Bennett's final act of courage, the meaning was clear. In a world where nature showed no mercy and survival required constant vigilance, the highest calling remained unchanged: to stand between the vulnerable and the void, to choose sacrifice over safety, and to face the darkness with nothing but faith and love as armor against the wild. The investigation into the December 1st incident expanded far beyond the immediate circumstances of the attack itself. Dr. Foster's team, now augmented with wildlife biologists from the University of Alaska and federal researchers from the National Park Service, conducted the most comprehensive study of aggressive bear behavior ever undertaken in North America. Their findings would revolutionize understanding of large predator psychology and force a complete re-evaluation of human-wildlife coexistence strategies. The research began with a detailed forensic analysis of the attack site. Crime scene investigators from the Alaska State Troopers processed St. Paul's Chapel with the same methodical precision used for homicide investigations, documenting every claw mark, every drop of blood, every fragment of torn fabric. Photographer Maria Santos, a specialist in wildlife incident documentation, spent 3 days capturing images that would later be used in court proceedings and scientific publications. What emerged from this analysis was a disturbing picture of calculated predatory behavior. The large male bear had not acted from hunger, fear, or territorial defense, the traditional motivations for bear attacks. Instead, the evidence suggested deliberate hunting behavior directed specifically at human prey. Claw marks on the chapel's exterior showed that the bear had tested multiple potential entry points before selecting the fellowship hall door. Scratch patterns indicated it had examined the building on at least 3 previous occasions, learning the structure's weaknesses and planning its approach. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the forensic veterinarian who examined the bear's carcass, discovered additional troubling details. The animal's stomach contained no natural food sources, no fish, berries, or vegetation typical of Kodiak bear diets. Instead, it was filled with garbage, pet food, and processed human food scraps. Tissue analysis revealed nutritional deficiencies, consistent with prolonged dependence on inappropriate food sources. This bear had essentially become a garbage addict, Dr. Walsh explained during a press conference 6 weeks after the attack. Its natural foraging instincts had been corrupted by easy access to human food waste. When those sources became scarce, it began viewing humans themselves as prey animals. The toxicology report revealed even more disturbing information. The bear's tissue samples contained elevated levels of heavy metals and industrial chemicals consistent with feeding from contaminated waste sites. Kodiak Island's legacy as a military installation during World War II had left behind several contaminated areas where improper waste disposal had created toxic hotspots. Bears feeding from these sites were ingesting substances that could affect their neurological function and decision-making processes. Dr. Marcus Rivera, a neurobiologist from Stanford University who joined the investigation team, theorized that chemical contamination might explain the bear's unprecedented aggressive behavior. Heavy metals like lead and mercury can cause brain damage in mammals, leading to increased aggression, impaired judgment, and loss of natural fear responses. This bear may have been literally poisoned into becoming a more effective killer. The implications of this discovery sent shockwaves through Alaska's wildlife management community. If environmental contamination was creating more aggressive bears, then traditional management strategies based on normal bear behavior would be inadequate. Every contaminated site across the state became a potential factory for producing dangerous animals. Meanwhile, at Providence Kodiak Island Medical Center, the human survivors of the attack were dealing with their own complex recovery processes. Frank Peterson's spinal injuries required multiple surgeries and months of rehabilitation that would ultimately prove insufficient to restore his mobility. Dr. Sarah Kim, the hospital's chief orthopedic surgeon, worked with a team of specialists from Anchorage and Seattle to explore every possible treatment option. The damage to Mr. Peterson's spinal cord was extensive, Dr. Kim explained to Frank's family during one of many difficult consultations. 3 vertebrae were completely crushed, and the cord itself was severed in 2 places. We've stabilized the injury to prevent further damage, but restoration of function is extremely unlikely. Frank faced his diagnosis with the same stoic courage he had shown in the chapel. I knew what I was doing when I drew that bear away from the others, he told his wife Betty during one of her daily visits. I'd make the same choice again tomorrow. Some things are more important than walking. Betty Peterson's Parkinson's disease accelerated dramatically in the weeks following the attack, as if the trauma had triggered a cascade of neurological deterioration. Her tremors became more severe, her mobility decreased, and her medication required constant adjustment. Dr. Robert Chen, the hospital's neurologist, suspected that the extreme stress of witnessing her husband's injury and living through the attack had exacerbated her condition beyond what would have occurred naturally. Trauma can act as a catalyst for neurodegenerative diseases, Dr. Chen explained to the family. The stress hormones released during life-threatening situations can accelerate the death of brain cells that are already compromised. Mrs. Peterson's Parkinson's has progressed at least 2 years faster than we would have expected under normal circumstances. The psychological impact on other survivors manifested in various forms of post-traumatic stress disorder. Dorothy Engelhardt, who had been the first to spot the bear at the Fellowship Hall window, developed severe agoraphobia that made leaving her home increasingly difficult. Dr. Lisa Martinez, a psychiatrist who volunteered her services to treat the chapel survivors, worked with Dorothy through months of therapy aimed at helping her reclaim basic daily activities. Dorothy's brain has essentially decided that the outside world is too dangerous to risk, Dr. Martinez explained during a case conference. Her nervous system is stuck in a permanent state of hypervigilance, scanning for threats that aren't there, Every unexpected noise, every shadow, every movement triggers the same fight-or-flight response she experienced when she saw that bear's eyes through the window. Dorothy's husband Walter became her primary caregiver, learning to navigate the complex landscape of her fears and limitations. A retired mechanic who had spent his career solving practical problems, Walter found himself challenged by issues that couldn't be fixed with tools and determination. He rearranged their home to minimize triggers, installed security cameras to help Dorothy feel safer, and gradually coaxed her into brief ventures outside under carefully controlled conditions. "She used to be the bravest woman I knew," Walter confided to Pastor Williams during one of their counseling sessions. "Dorothy would hike alone in the mountains, go camping by herself, never showed fear of anything. Now she's terrified to walk to the mailbox. It's like the bear took away more than just her sense of safety. It took away who she was." Sarah Chen's response to the trauma took a different form. Instead of withdrawing from the world, she became hyperactive, throwing herself into obsessive research about bear behavior, self-defense techniques, and wilderness survival skills. Her small apartment became filled with books, maps, and equipment that she studied with the intensity of someone preparing for war. "Sarah is trying to regain control through knowledge," Dr. Martinez observed. "If she can understand every aspect of bear behavior, if she can master every survival technique, then maybe she can prevent this kind of vulnerability from ever happening again." It's a common response, but it can become destructive if the person becomes completely consumed by the need for preparedness. Sarah's research led her to discover information about bear attacks that most of the public never saw. She obtained autopsy reports from similar incidents across Alaska, studied attack patterns and victim demographics, and created detailed maps showing the locations and circumstances of every documented bear encounter on Kodiak Island over the previous 50 years. Her apartment wall became covered with charts, graphs, and photographs that would have been appropriate for a criminal investigation unit. The most disturbing pattern Sarah identified was the increasing frequency of attacks in populated areas. Bears were not just becoming more aggressive, they were specifically targeting locations where humans gathered in groups. Schools, churches, community centers, and shopping areas were experiencing unprecedented levels of bear investigation and intrusion. Traditional wildlife management assumed that bears would avoid human activity, but the data suggested exactly the opposite trend. "They're learning from each other," Sarah concluded during a presentation to the City Council 6 months after the attack. "When one bear successfully accesses food from a human structure, others observe and replicate the behavior. We're essentially teaching them to see our buildings as feeding opportunities." City officials initially dismissed Sarah's theories as the product of trauma-induced paranoia, but subsequent events proved her analysis disturbingly accurate. 3 more churches experienced bear intrusions over the following year, along with 2 schools and the island's main grocery store. Each incident involved bears that demonstrated the same systematic investigation behavior that had preceded the chapel attack. Agnes Thompson's recovery followed a completely different trajectory. Despite being the oldest survivor and having had the closest encounter with the bears, she showed remarkable psychological resilience. She returned to her normal routines within weeks, continued attending services at St. Paul's Chapel, and refused to acknowledge that the attack had fundamentally changed her life. "Agnes is either the healthiest person psychologically that I've ever met, or she's engaged in the most complete denial I've ever witnessed," Dr. Martinez noted during a consultation. Her refusal to be affected by the trauma is almost as concerning as the severe reactions we're seeing in other survivors. But Agnes's apparent resilience masked a deeper transformation that became evident only to those who knew her well. Her great-niece Jennifer Thompson, who visited weekly to help with household tasks, noticed subtle changes in her aunt's behavior. Agnes had begun keeping a loaded shotgun beside her bed, something she had never done in 8 decades of living alone. She installed motion sensor lights around her property and began checking locks multiple times before bed. Aunt Agnes talks about faith conquering fear, but she's taking an awful lot of precautions for someone who isn't afraid, Jennifer observed. I think she's decided that God helps those who help themselves, and she's making sure she's prepared to help herself if another bear comes calling. The media attention surrounding the incident created its own set of challenges for survivors. News crews from across the United States descended on Kodiak, seeking interviews with people who had lived through one of the most dramatic wildlife attacks in Alaska history. The story had everything that captured public imagination: religious faith, elderly victims, heroic sacrifice, and the primal terror of being hunted by an apex predator. CNN's Anderson Cooper arrived on the island 2 weeks after the attack, bringing a full production crew to create a special investigation into Alaska's growing bear problem. His interview with Agnes Thompson became the most watched segment of his program that year, particularly the moment when she described looking into the bear's eyes during their sanctuary standoff. There was intelligence there, Agnes told Cooper, her voice steady despite the cameras and lights surrounding her in the chapel sanctuary. That bear wasn't just a wild animal acting on instinct. It was thinking, planning, making decisions. That's what made it so terrifying. The realization that we weren't dealing with a mindless beast, but with something that could outsmart us. Cooper's report included dramatic recreations of the attack, using computer graphics to show the bear's movements through the building and highlighting the split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death. The segment won several journalism awards, but it also brought unwanted attention to a community still struggling to process its trauma. National Geographic sent a team led by wildlife photographer Joel Sartore to document the aftermath and investigate the environmental factors that had contributed to the attack. Sartore spent 3 months on Kodiak, capturing images that would later appear in a feature story titled "When Wild Alaska Comes to Church." His photographs of the damaged chapel, the memorial plaque, and the survivors became iconic representations of humanity's fragile relationship with nature. What happened at St. Paul's Chapel was a collision between 2 worlds that don't really understand each other, Sartore explained in his article. Human beings want to believe we've tamed the wilderness, that our buildings and communities provide safety from the natural world. But Alaska doesn't recognize those boundaries. Here, the wild is always just outside the door, and sometimes it decides to come inside. The Discovery Channel commissioned a full documentary about the incident, titled "Faith versus Fury: The Kodiak Chapel Attack." The production team included bear behavior specialists, trauma psychologists, and religious scholars who attempted to analyze the event from multiple perspectives. The documentary's most powerful segment featured Frank Peterson describing his decision to draw the bear's attention, filmed from his wheelchair 6 months after the attack. "People keep asking me if I regret what I did, if I would make the same choice knowing what I know now," Frank said, his voice weak but determined. "The answer is yes, absolutely yes. I look at my congregation. These are people I've known for decades. People who've been like family to me. If a bear or anything else threatens them, I'm going to put myself between them and danger. That's what you do for family." The documentary also included disturbing footage from the chapel's security camera, which had continued recording throughout the attack. The images were heavily edited to remove the most graphic content, but they provided unprecedented documentation of bear behavior during an aggressive encounter with humans. Wildlife experts studied every frame, analyzing the animal's body language, movement patterns, and decision-making processes. Dr. Foster used this footage to develop new protocols for predicting bear aggression. We can see clear warning signs in the animal's posture and movement that indicate when investigation behavior is transitioning to hunting behavior, she explained. The bear's approach changes from curious exploration to purposeful stalking, and there's usually a window of several minutes when intervention might still be possible. These insights led to the development of new early warning systems for communities across Alaska. Wildlife cameras equipped with artificial intelligence software were programmed to recognize specific bear behaviors and automatically alert authorities when animals showed signs of transitioning from normal foraging to aggressive hunting modes. The system was first tested on Kodiak Island and proved remarkably effective at predicting dangerous encounters before they occurred. The legal ramifications of the attack continued to unfold for years after the incident. Rebecca Bennett Morrison's wrongful death lawsuit against the state of Alaska became a landmark case that established new standards for government responsibility in wildlife management. The state's initial position that bear attacks were simply an unavoidable risk of living in Alaska was challenged by evidence that officials had failed to warn communities despite knowing about unusual bear behavior patterns. Attorney General Patricia Walsh defended the state's position during months of depositions and court hearings. The government cannot be held responsible for the actions of wild animals, she argued. Alaska residents accept certain risks as part of living in a frontier environment. We provide warnings and education, but we cannot guarantee safety from wildlife. Rebecca's legal team, led by prominent personal injury attorney Michael Chen from Anchorage, argued that the state had been negligent in its response to mounting evidence of unusual bear behavior. They presented documentation showing that fish and game officials had received multiple reports of bears investigating human structures in the weeks before the attack, but had failed to issue public warnings or take preventive action. This was not an unpredictable act of nature, Chen argued during his closing statement. This was the predictable result of systematic government failure to protect public safety. The state knew that bears were exhibiting unprecedented aggressive behavior, and they chose to do nothing until people died. The case was complicated by questions about government immunity and the extent to which state agencies could be held liable for failing to prevent wildlife attacks. Alaska's legal system had no clear precedent for such cases, forcing judges to balance public safety concerns against practical limitations on government resources and authority. Expert witnesses testified about the feasibility of various preventive measures that might have been implemented. Dr. Foster argued that enhanced monitoring and public warnings could have significantly reduced the risk of the attack. Wildlife management specialist Dr. Robert Martinez from Montana testified that other states had successfully implemented programs that tracked dangerous animals and prevented human encounters. But state witnesses argued that such measures were impractical given Alaska's vast wilderness and limited resources. Fish and Game Director Susan Williams testified that her agency was already stretched beyond its capacity trying to manage human-wildlife conflicts across a state larger than Texas, Montana, and California combined. We have 14 wildlife troopers responsible for covering 570,000 square miles, Williams explained. Even if we had unlimited resources, it would be impossible to monitor every bear and predict every potential conflict. We do our best to educate the public and respond to immediate threats, but we cannot provide guarantees of safety in a state where humans are vastly outnumbered by large predators. The case ultimately settled for $3.2 million, with the state admitting no wrongdoing but agreeing to implement new wildlife monitoring and public notification systems. The settlement also funded the establishment of the Charles Bennett Wildlife Safety Foundation, which provides training and equipment to communities across rural Alaska. Rebecca Bennett Morrison, used her portion of the settlement to establish a scholarship fund for students pursuing careers in wildlife biology or emergency medicine, fields that her father had valued highly. "Dad always believed that education was the key to solving problems," she said during the fund's inaugural ceremony. He would want his death to contribute to research and training that might prevent future tragedies. The psychological impact of the attack extended far beyond the immediate survivors to affect the entire Kodiak community. Dr. Martinez established a long-term study to track mental health outcomes among residents, finding elevated rates of anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress symptoms throughout the population. Even people who had not directly witnessed the attack reported changes in their behavior and outlook. Local restaurant owner Maria Santos found herself unable to take out trash after dark, despite having done so for 20 years without concern. "I know it's irrational," she admitted during one of Dr. Martinez's interviews. "The attack happened during the day at a church, nowhere near my restaurant, but something fundamental has changed about how safe I feel on this island. Every shadow could be a bear, every noise could be something coming to get me." The island's children were particularly affected, with school counselors reporting increased behavioral problems, sleep disturbances, and academic difficulties in the months following the attack. Third-grade teacher Nancy Wilson noticed that her students had begun incorporating bears into their artwork, stories, and imaginative play in ways that suggested ongoing anxiety and preoccupation with the threat of animal attacks. "The children are processing this trauma through their play and creativity," explained child psychologist Dr. Susan Roberts, who was brought in to help the school system address these concerns. "Bears have become symbols of unpredictable danger in their minds. They're trying to gain some sense of control by drawing pictures of bears, writing stories about defeating bears, and acting out scenarios where they successfully escape from bear encounters." The school district implemented new safety protocols that reflected the reality of operating in an environment where large predators might pose an ongoing threat. Emergency drills now included bear protocols, similar to tornado or fire drills, with specific procedures for lockdown and evacuation. Playground supervision was increased, and outdoor activities were modified to ensure that children were never more than a few seconds away from secure buildings. Some parents began keeping their children indoors, except for essential activities, creating a generation of young Alaskans who were more isolated from the natural environment than any in the state's history. Dr. Roberts worried that this overprotective response might create long-term psychological problems that could be more damaging than the original trauma. "Children need to develop healthy relationships with the natural world, even in Alaska, where that world includes significant dangers," she explained. "If we teach them to fear everything outside their homes, we're raising a generation that will never learn to live successfully in this environment." The economic impact of the attack reverberated through Kodiak's tourism industry, which had been growing steadily as visitors sought authentic Alaska experiences. Several tour operators reported cancellations and reduced bookings as potential visitors decided that the island was too dangerous for recreational activities. The Kodiak Island Tourism Board launched a public relations campaign aimed at reassuring tourists that the attack was an isolated incident unlikely to be repeated. But the reassurances were undermined by subsequent bear encounters that suggested the December 1st attack was part of a broader pattern of increased aggression. 2 hiking groups were stalked by bears in the months following the Chapel incident, and several fishing lodges reported persistent problems with bears investigating their facilities. Each new incident reinforced public perception that Kodiak Island had become significantly more dangerous for human activity, Lodge owner Jack Morrison, whose business had operated successfully for 15 years, found himself installing expensive bear deterrent systems and hiring armed guides for activities that had previously been considered safe for unaccompanied guests. "The insurance companies are demanding these measures," he explained. "They're treating Kodiak like a war zone now, and the premiums reflect that level of risk." The Alaska Department of Commerce conducted an economic impact study that estimated the chapel attack and its aftermath cost the local economy approximately $12 million in the first year alone. Tourism revenue dropped by 30%, property values declined in areas considered high risk for bear encounters, and businesses struggled with increased insurance costs and security expenses. But some entrepreneurs found opportunity in the crisis. Security consultant David Park established a thriving business providing bear-proofing services to homes and businesses across the island. His company installed reinforced doors, security windows, and electronic deterrent systems that became standard features of new construction. Unfortunately, what happened at the chapel made everyone realize how vulnerable our buildings really are, Park explained while installing a steel security door at a local daycare center. "A motivated bear can go through most residential construction like it's made of paper. People want to feel safe in their own homes and businesses." The religious community on Kodiak struggled to make sense of an attack that had occurred during worship and had claimed the life of a beloved pastor. Father Alexei Volkov of the Russian Orthodox Cathedral organized interfaith discussions aimed at helping people process the theological implications of such seemingly senseless violence. Many people are asking how God could allow such a thing to happen in his house to his faithful servant, Father Volkov explained during one of these sessions. "These are ancient questions that have challenged believers since Job. We cannot pretend to understand God's purposes, but we can choose to respond with faith rather than despair." Some congregants found their faith strengthened by witnessing Charles Bennett's sacrifice and the community's response to tragedy. Others struggled with doubts about divine protection and the efficacy of prayer. The attack forced conversations about theodicy and divine justice that many rural Alaska churches had never needed to address directly. Pastor Williams worked to rebuild his congregation's sense of security while acknowledging that their innocence about safety in God's house had been permanently shattered. His sermons began to address themes of suffering, persecution, and martyrdom that reflected the new reality facing Christians living on the edge of wilderness. Christ himself was killed by the powers of this world, Williams preached during a service 6 months after the attack. The apostles were martyred. The early Christians were thrown to lions. Believers throughout history have died for their faith. We are not promised safety. We are promised purpose. Charles Bennett found his purpose in protecting others, just as Christ found his purpose in dying for our salvation. The chapel's memorial plaque became a pilgrimage site for visitors from across Alaska and beyond. People came to honor Charles Bennett's memory, to pray for the survivors, and to contemplate the fragile boundary between civilization and wilderness. The site attracted not only Christians, but also secular visitors who were moved by the story of ordinary people displaying extraordinary courage under impossible circumstances. Agnes Thompson often found herself serving as an unofficial guide for these visitors, sharing her memories of that December morning and helping people understand what the attack had meant to the community. Despite her advanced age, she seemed to gain energy from these conversations, as if bearing witness to the events had become her own form of ministry. "People want to know if we were really praying when the bear was watching us," Agnes told a group of theology students from Seattle Pacific University during one of their visits. "They want to know if prayer actually helped, if God was really there with us, All I can tell them is that 23 people walked into that sanctuary that morning, and 21 of them walked out alive. Frank Peterson can't walk anymore, and Charles Bennett is with the Lord. But the rest of us are here to tell the story. That has to mean something. The scientific investigation into the attack continued to yield new insights about bear behavior and intelligence that revolutionized wildlife management practices. Dr. Foster's team published a series of papers documenting cognitive abilities in Kodiak, bears that had previously been considered beyond the capability of non-human animals. Video analysis from the chapel's security cameras showed that the large male bear had demonstrated what researchers termed theory of mind, the ability to understand that other beings have thoughts and intentions different from one's own. The bear's behavior suggested it had predicted how humans would respond to its presence and had planned its actions accordingly. This bear anticipated that the humans would try to escape through the front doors, Dr. Foster explained during a presentation to the International Association for Bear Research and Management. It positioned itself to intercept that escape route while using its companion to drive the prey toward the anticipated exit. This level of strategic planning indicates cognitive abilities that we're only beginning to understand. The implications for human safety were profound. If bears could predict human behavior and plan complex hunting strategies, then traditional safety recommendations based on assumptions about animal intelligence needed to be completely reevaluated. Wildlife management agencies across North America began developing new protocols that accounted for the possibility that large predators were far more intelligent than previously believed. Dr. Rivera's research into environmental contamination and its effects on bear behavior led to the identification of several other sites across Alaska where toxic exposure might be creating unusually aggressive animals. The Department of Environmental Conservation launched a comprehensive study of contaminated areas and their potential impact on wildlife behavior, finding correlations between chemical exposure and increased aggression in multiple species. We're essentially conducting an uncontrolled experiment on Alaska's wildlife, Dr. Rivera warned during congressional testimony about environmental contamination. Decades of military activity, mining operations, and industrial development have left behind toxic legacies that are altering animal behavior in ways we're only beginning to understand. The Kodiak Chapel attack may be just the beginning. Federal funding was allocated to begin cleanup operations at the most contaminated sites, but the process was expected to take decades and cost hundreds of millions of dollars. In the meantime, communities near these areas were advised to implement enhanced safety measures and monitoring systems to detect signs of unusual animal behavior. The attack also prompted changes in emergency response protocols across Alaska. The confusion and communication problems that had hampered the initial response to the chapel incident led to the development of new coordination systems for managing wildlife emergencies. First responders received enhanced training in bear behavior and crowd management during wildlife encounters. Emergency medical technician Jennifer Walsh, who had treated Charles Bennett at the scene, became an instructor in a new curriculum that taught medical personnel how to provide care in active wildlife threat situations. Her training program emphasized the importance of scene safety and the need to balance patient care with protection from ongoing animal threats. We learned that traditional EMS protocols don't account for the possibility that the threat that caused the injuries is still present and actively hunting, Walsh explained during one of her training sessions. You can't just focus on treating the patient. You have to be constantly aware that you might become the next victim. The psychological support systems for emergency responders also needed to be enhanced. Several officers and paramedics who had witnessed the attack developed their own trauma symptoms, including recurring nightmares, hypervigilance, and difficulty performing their duties. The state implemented new peer support programs and mandatory counseling services for personnel involved in serious wildlife incidents. Officer Brennan, who had been forced to shoot the large male bear, struggled with the decision despite understanding its necessity. "I've been a wildlife officer for 20 years, and I've always believed that we should coexist with Alaska's animals," he said during a counseling session. "Having to kill that bear, even to save human lives, felt like a failure of everything I stand for." The bear's death also raised questions about the ethics of killing animals that might be acting abnormally due to human-caused environmental contamination. If toxic exposure had altered the bear's behavior and made it more aggressive, was it fair to blame the animal for actions that were ultimately caused by human activity? Animal rights organizations criticized the decision to kill the bear rather than attempting to capture and relocate it. They argued that the bear was essentially a victim of environmental damage and that lethal force should have been a last resort. Wildlife officials responded that the immediate threat to human life made capture attempts too dangerous to consider. That bear weighed 1,500 pounds, had already killed one person and seriously injured another, and was showing no signs of backing down, Officer Brennan explained during a public hearing on the incident. Tranquilizer darts take several minutes to work, and dart guns are notoriously unreliable. In the time it would have taken to immobilize the animal safely, more people would have died. The debate highlighted the complex ethical issues surrounding human-wildlife conflicts in an era of environmental degradation and climate change. As human activities continued to alter natural systems, wildlife populations were being forced to adapt in ways that sometimes brought them into deadly conflict with the people who had changed their world. The Chapel attack became a case study in wildlife management programs at universities across North America. Students studied the incident to understand how multiple factors, environmental contamination, climate change, habitat alteration, and human behavior, could combine to create catastrophic outcomes that were difficult to predict or prevent. Professor Sandra Martinez of the University of Alaska Fairbanks used the case in her graduate seminar on human-wildlife conflict resolution. This incident demonstrates that we can no longer think of wildlife management as simply managing animals, she explained to her students. We have to manage entire ecosystems, including the human components, and we have to account for the unintended consequences of our past actions on current animal behavior. The integration of multiple academic disciplines became essential for understanding complex incidents like the Chapel attack. Wildlife biologists worked with toxicologists, psychologists, sociologists, and emergency management specialists to develop comprehensive approaches to preventing similar tragedies. The incident highlighted the need for interdisciplinary cooperation in addressing environmental challenges. 2 years after the attack, Dr. Foster published her landmark study titled Cognitive Evolution in Ursus arctos middendorfi, Environmental Stresses and Behavioral Adaptation in Kodiak Brown Bears. The paper documented evidence that the island's bear population was undergoing rapid behavioral changes in response to environmental pressures, developing new survival strategies that brought them into increasing conflict with human populations. What we're seeing is essentially accelerated evolution, Dr. Foster explained during her presentation at the International Wildlife Behavior Conference in Vancouver. Environmental pressures are selecting for bears that can successfully exploit human resources. Those that learn to associate human structures with food sources survive better than those that maintain traditional foraging patterns. Over just a few generations, we're seeing the emergence of a more human-adapted subspecies. The implications were staggering. If Kodiak bears were evolutionarily adapting to exploit human resources, then the attack on St. Paul's Chapel represented not an aberrant incident, but the beginning of a new chapter in human-bear coexistence. Traditional management strategies based on maintaining separation between human and bear territories would become increasingly ineffective. Dr. Foster's research team documented dozens of behavioral innovations that had spread through the bear population following the chapel incident. Bears had learned to open car doors, manipulate simple latches, and coordinate group activities to access human food sources. Most troubling was evidence that these learned behaviors were being passed from mother bears to their cubs, creating a cultural transmission of human exploitation techniques. Camera trap footage from around Kodiak revealed bears conducting systematic surveillance of human activities, learning daily routines, and identifying predictable patterns of vulnerability. One particularly intelligent female, designated Bear 247 by researchers, had learned the schedules of garbage collection trucks and would position herself to intercept vehicles at optimal locations. She had also taught this technique to her two cubs, who demonstrated the same behavioral pattern. We're witnessing the emergence of a bear culture that specifically targets human resources, Dr. Foster noted. These animals are developing traditions and knowledge systems that are passed down through generations. In essence, they're becoming more human-like in their approach to resource exploitation. The research attracted attention from evolutionary biologists worldwide, who saw in Kodiak's bears a real-time example of how species adapt to rapid environmental change. Dr. Patricia Williams from Harvard University's Department of Evolutionary Biology established a long-term research partnership with Dr. Foster to document the ongoing behavioral changes. This is unprecedented in terms of the speed of adaptation, Dr. Williams observed. Typically, evolutionary changes occur over hundreds or thousands of generations. What we're seeing on Kodiak is significant behavioral modification happening within just a few years. It suggests that large mammals are capable of much more rapid adaptation than we previously believed. The behavioral changes weren't limited to food acquisition strategies. Bears were also demonstrating new forms of social organization, with evidence of cooperative hunting behaviors that had never been documented in solitary species like brown bears. Trail cameras captured footage of multiple bears working together to access human food sources, with individuals taking specific roles in complex operations. One incident documented by researchers showed 3 adult bears coordinating to break into a fish processing facility, while one bear created a distraction at the building's front entrance. Drawing the attention of human workers, the other 2 accessed a rear loading dock and systematically removed salmon from storage containers. The operation demonstrated planning, communication and role specialization that challenged fundamental assumptions about bear intelligence. They're problem-solving at a level that approaches that of great apes, Dr. Foster explained. But unlike chimpanzees or gorillas, these animals weigh up to 1,500 pounds and are equipped with natural weapons that can kill humans instantly. We're dealing with the emergence of super predators that combine primate-level intelligence with the physical capabilities of apex carnivores. The research findings prompted emergency meetings among wildlife management agencies across North America. If similar behavioral adaptations were occurring in other bear populations, the implications for public safety were catastrophic. Traditional assumptions about bear behavior, upon which all existing safety protocols were based, might no longer be valid. Alaska Governor Jennifer Walsh convened a special commission to develop new strategies for managing what experts were beginning to call human-adapted bears. The commission included wildlife biologists, public safety officials, emergency responders, and community representatives who would be responsible for implementing whatever recommendations emerged from their deliberations. We're facing a new category of wildlife threat that our existing systems aren't designed to handle, Governor Walsh explained during the Commission's first meeting. These bears aren't just wandering into human areas by accident. They're actively seeking us out because we've become part of their survival strategy. That requires completely new approaches to public safety and wildlife management. The Commission's preliminary recommendations included the establishment of specialized bear response teams equipped with advanced weapons and non-lethal deterrent systems. These teams would be stationed in communities across Alaska and trained to respond immediately to reports of intelligent bear behavior that suggested human adaptive learning. More controversially, the Commission recommended implementing lethal control programs targeting bears that demonstrated advanced human exploitation behaviors. Critics argued that killing the most intelligent bears would slow down the adaptive process, but might also select for bears that were better at avoiding human detection while maintaining their human-focused survival strategies. We might be creating an evolutionary arms race, warned Dr. Martinez during testimony before the Commission. If we systematically remove the bears that we can identify as human-adapted, we may be selecting for bears that are even better at exploiting human resources while remaining undetected. The result could be a population of super-intelligent predators that are essentially invisible until they strike. The debate reflected a broader philosophical question about humanity's relationship with evolving wildlife populations. Should humans attempt to guide or control the evolutionary process when it produced outcomes that threatened human safety? Or did interfering with natural selection represent an arrogant assumption of authority over biological systems that were beyond human comprehension or control? Religious communities across Alaska found themselves grappling with theological implications of the emerging research. If God had created a natural world that could adapt and evolve, what was humanity's responsibility when that evolution produced dangerous outcomes? Some saw the intelligent bears as evidence of divine creativity and adaptation, while others viewed them as a consequence of human environmental damage that required corrective action. Father Volkov organized a series of theological discussions that brought together religious leaders from multiple denominations to address these questions. Are we witnessing God's creative power at work, or are we seeing the consequences of human sin in our treatment of creation? He asked during one session. The bears that killed Charles Bennett may be products of environmental contamination caused by human carelessness. If so, are we morally obligated to address the root causes rather than simply killing the animals? The discussions revealed deep divisions within Alaska's religious community. Some denominations emphasized humanity's biblical mandate to exercise dominion over nature, arguing that controlling dangerous wildlife was a God-given responsibility. Others focused on stewardship obligations, suggesting that humans should address the environmental problems that had created dangerous wildlife rather than killing animals that were adapting to human-caused changes. Pastor Williams found himself at the center of these debates, as the minister who had inherited Charles Bennett's congregation and mission. His own theological views had evolved significantly in the 2 years since the attack, shaped by his ongoing counseling work with survivors and his growing understanding of the complex environmental factors involved. I used to think that faith and reason were separate domains, Williams explained during one theological discussion. But studying what happened to our congregation has taught me that understanding God's creation requires both spiritual wisdom and scientific knowledge. We can't address the bear problem through prayer alone, and we can't solve it through science alone. We need both. Williams had begun incorporating environmental themes into his sermons, arguing that caring for creation was a fundamental Christian responsibility that required addressing issues like toxic contamination and habitat destruction. His approach attracted new congregants who were concerned about environmental issues, but had previously felt unwelcome in traditional churches. The chapel's congregation had grown from its post-attack low of fewer than a dozen regular attendees to nearly 40 people who gathered each Sunday. Many were younger residents of Kodiak who appreciated Williams's integration of faith and environmental consciousness, but the growth also created tensions with older members who preferred Charles Bennett's more traditional approach to ministry. "Pastor Bennett preached about love and salvation," complained longtime member Dorothy Williams during a church board meeting. "Pastor Williams preaches about contaminated soil and bare intelligence. I come to church to hear about God, not about environmental science." Williams struggled to balance the theological needs of his diverse congregation while remaining faithful to his own understanding of how faith should respond to contemporary challenges. He had come to believe that the chapel attack was inseparable from broader questions about humanity's relationship with the natural world, but communicating that connection to grieving and traumatized parishioners required enormous sensitivity. The memorial services held on each anniversary of the attack became focal points for these theological discussions. The second anniversary service drew nearly 300 people, including survivors from the original attack, family members of those who had died or been injured, researchers who had studied the incident, and religious pilgrims who had traveled to Kodiak specifically to visit the site. Frank Peterson delivered the memorial address from his wheelchair, his voice stronger than it had been in months. His speech focused on the theme of sacrifice and service that had characterized Charles Bennett's final moments and his own decision to draw the bear away from more vulnerable congregants. "Charles didn't die because God abandoned him," Frank said, his words carrying clearly through the packed sanctuary. "He died because he chose to embody God's love in the most dangerous possible circumstances. When faced with a choice between his own safety and the safety of others, he chose others. That's what disciples do. They follow Christ's example of self-sacrificial love." The address received national attention when excerpts were broadcast on religious television programs and posted on social media platforms. Frank's words resonated with audiences far beyond Alaska, speaking to broader questions about courage, sacrifice, and moral responsibility in dangerous times. But the memorial service also highlighted ongoing divisions within the survivor community about how to interpret and commemorate the attack. Some survivors wanted the focus to remain on the human courage and faith demonstrated during the crisis. Others felt it was important to address the environmental and systemic factors that had contributed to the bear's aggressive behavior. Sarah Chen had become the most vocal advocate for addressing root causes rather than simply memorializing victims. Her research into bear attack patterns had evolved into advocacy work aimed at forcing government agencies and private companies to take responsibility for environmental contamination that might be affecting wildlife behavior. "We can pray for the dead and honor their sacrifice," Sarah said during a community meeting 6 months before the second anniversary. "But if we really want to honor Charles Bennett and Frank Peterson, we should make sure this never happens again. That means cleaning up contaminated sites, changing waste management practices, and holding polluters accountable for the consequences of their actions." Sarah's advocacy efforts had led to her involvement with several environmental organizations that were using the chapel attack as a case study in their campaigns for stronger pollution controls and corporate accountability. Her apartment had become an informal research center where volunteers compiled data about environmental contamination and wildlife behavior across Alaska. The work had given Sarah a sense of purpose that helped her process her own trauma from the attack. But it had also isolated her from other survivors who felt she was exploiting their tragedy for political purposes. The tension came to a head during a survivors' support group meeting when Sarah presented her latest findings about contaminated military sites across the state. "Sarah, we appreciate your research," said Dorothy Engelhardt, who had made significant progress in managing her anxiety but still struggled with crowds and unfamiliar situations. "But some of us just want to heal and move on with our lives. We don't want to spend every meeting talking about pollution and government failures. We want to talk about recovery and rebuilding our sense of safety." Dr. Martinez, who continued to facilitate the support group meetings, worked to help survivors understand their different coping mechanisms and healing trajectories. Some people found meaning through activism and advocacy, while others needed to focus on personal recovery and restoration of normal routines. "There's no right or wrong way to process trauma," Dr. Martinez explained. "Sarah finds healing through research and advocacy. Dorothy finds healing through gradual reintegration into normal activities. Agnes finds healing through faith and community service. These different approaches can coexist, but they require mutual respect and understanding." The support group had become a model for trauma recovery programs across Alaska, demonstrating how communities could provide ongoing assistance to survivors of wildlife attacks and other natural disasters. Dr. Martinez published several papers about the group's methods and outcomes, contributing to a growing body of literature about community-based trauma recovery. Her research showed that survivors who maintained connections with their community and found ways to contribute to collective healing generally had better long-term outcomes than those who tried to cope in isolation. The chapel survivors who remained engaged with church activities, advocacy work, or support group participation showed lower rates of depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress symptoms. But the research also revealed that trauma recovery was not a linear process with a clear endpoint. Even survivors who seemed to have adjusted well to their post-attack lives continued to experience periodic setbacks triggered by news coverage of similar incidents, anniversary dates, or unexpected reminders of their experience. Agnes Thompson, despite her remarkable apparent resilience, admitted during a private conversation with Dr. Martinez that she still experienced nightmares about the attack. "People think I'm over it because I don't talk about it constantly," she said. "But I dream about that bear's eyes at least once a week. I wake up feeling like it's still watching me, still deciding whether I'm prey or not." Dr. Martinez helped Agnes understand that such ongoing symptoms were normal and didn't represent failure in her recovery process. "Trauma changes us," she explained. "We don't get over experiences like what you went through. We learn to integrate them into our lives in ways that allow us to continue functioning and finding meaning." The third anniversary of the attack was marked by the dedication of the Charles Bennett Wildlife Safety Research Center, a joint facility operated by the University of Alaska and the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. The center was funded through a combination of state appropriations, federal grants, and private donations, including contributions from people across the United States who had been moved by the story of the chapel attack. Dr. Foster was appointed as the center's first director, with a mandate to conduct research into human-wildlife conflict prevention and develop new strategies for managing intelligent predator populations. The center's mission statement specifically referenced the chapel attack as an example of the complex challenges facing Alaska communities in an era of rapid environmental change. The Charles Bennett Center represents our commitment to ensuring that his sacrifice contributes to knowledge that will protect others, Governor Walsh said during the dedication ceremony. "We cannot prevent all wildlife attacks, but we can learn from this tragedy to reduce the risk of similar incidents in the future." The center's research programs included studies of environmental contamination and its effects on animal behavior, development of new technologies for monitoring and deterring dangerous wildlife, and training programs for emergency responders and community leaders. The facility also housed a museum and educational center that told the story of the chapel attack and its aftermath. Rebecca Bennett Morrison attended the dedication ceremony with her teenage children, who were meeting many of their grandfather's friends and parishioners for the first time. The visit to Kodiak was emotional for the family, but Rebecca felt it was important for her children to understand the community that had shaped their grandfather's life and ministry. Dad always said that his greatest joy was serving the people of Kodiak, Rebecca told the assembled crowd. He loved this island, these mountains, even the bears that eventually killed him. He would be proud to know that his death is contributing to research that might help people and wildlife coexist more safely. The ceremony also featured the unveiling of a bronze statue depicting Charles Bennett in his final moments, arms spread wide as he faced the attacking bear. The sculpture, created by Alaska artist Maria Santos, captured both the terror and the heroism of that December morning. Some community members felt the statue was too graphic and traumatic, while others argued it accurately represented the reality of what had occurred. Art should comfort the disturbed and disturb the comfortable, Santos explained during the controversy over her sculpture. This statue is meant to make people think about sacrifice, courage, and the price of discipleship. If it makes them uncomfortable, maybe that's appropriate. The statue became another pilgrimage site for visitors to Kodiak, particularly for Christians who saw in Charles Bennett's story a modern example of martyrdom and self-sacrificial love. Religious tour groups began including the chapel and memorial center in their Alaska itineraries, creating a small but steady stream of faith-based tourism. Local businesses initially welcomed the additional visitors, but some community members worried that their tragedy was being commercialized and exploited for economic benefit. The tension reflected broader questions about how communities should balance memorial preservation with the need to move forward and rebuild. Pastor Williams worked to ensure that the increased visitor traffic didn't interfere with the chapel's ongoing ministry to local residents. Special visiting hours were established for tourists, while regular service times remained focused on the needs of the local congregation. The church also developed educational materials that helped visitors understand the religious and cultural context of the attack. We want people to understand that this is still a living church, not just a historical site, Williams explained. The attack was a tragedy, but it wasn't the end of our story. We're still here, still serving this community, still proclaiming the gospel in one of the most beautiful and dangerous places on earth. The ongoing evolution of bear behavior continued to challenge wildlife management strategies across Alaska. Dr. Foster's research documented the spread of human adaptive behaviors from Kodiak to other areas of the state, suggesting that the innovations developed by Kodiak bears were being transmitted to mainland populations through unknown mechanisms. Bears on the Kenai Peninsula began demonstrating systematic investigation of human structures using techniques that were identical to those observed on Kodiak. Similar behaviors were documented in southeast Alaska around Glacier Bay National Park and even in interior regions around Fairbanks. The speed of this behavioral transmission suggested either genetic predisposition or cultural learning networks that operated across much larger areas than previously believed possible. We're seeing the emergence of a new ecological relationship between humans and bears across Alaska, Dr. Foster reported during a legislative hearing in Juneau. What began as an isolated adaptation on Kodiak Island has become a statewide phenomenon that's fundamentally changing how these animals interact with human populations. The implications for tourism, outdoor recreation, and rural community safety were enormous. If bears throughout Alaska were developing enhanced capabilities for exploiting human resources, then existing safety protocols would need to be completely revised. The economic costs of implementing new safety measures could be prohibitive for many rural communities. Governor Walsh requested federal assistance to address what was being characterized as a statewide emergency in human-wildlife relations. The request included funding for enhanced monitoring systems, community safety equipment, and research programs aimed at developing long-term solutions. Alaska is essentially serving as a laboratory for understanding how large predators adapt to human-dominated landscapes, Governor Walsh explained in her letter to federal officials. The lessons we learn here will have implications for wildlife management throughout North America as climate change and habitat modification force other species to develop new survival strategies. The federal response was complicated by political disagreements about environmental regulation and wildlife management authority. Some officials argued that Alaska's problems were the result of inadequate state-level environmental protection and should be addressed through local regulatory changes. Others recognized that the challenges transcended state boundaries and required coordinated federal intervention. The debate reflected broader national divisions about environmental policy and the role of government in addressing climate-related challenges. Alaska's bear problem became a symbol in these larger political discussions, with different factions using the Chapel attack to support their preferred policy approaches. Conservative commentators argued that the incident demonstrated the need for stronger property rights and individual self-defense capabilities. They supported loosening restrictions on civilian ownership of high-powered weapons and reducing government regulations that limited private wildlife control efforts. Liberal commentators focused on environmental contamination and corporate responsibility, arguing that the bear problem was a consequence of inadequate pollution controls and insufficient corporate accountability. They supported increased funding for environmental cleanup and stronger regulations on industrial activities that might affect wildlife behavior. Lost in the political debate was the day-to-day reality facing communities like Kodiak, where residents had to navigate increasingly dangerous interactions with wildlife that was becoming more intelligent and more aggressive. The abstract policy discussions in Washington, D.C. seemed disconnected from the practical challenges of taking out trash, walking to work, or letting children play outside. Local officials developed their own pragmatic approaches to managing the enhanced bear threat. The city of Kodiak implemented new building codes that required bear-proof construction for all new commercial and residential structures. Zoning regulations were modified to require larger buffer zones between human activities and wildlife habitat. Public education programs were expanded to teach residents about the new behavioral patterns they might encounter. But individual preparedness could only go so far in addressing a problem that was fundamentally ecological and social in scope. The bears' enhanced intelligence and coordination meant that they could overcome individual deterrent measures through collective problem-solving and persistent effort. What was needed was a comprehensive approach that addressed the underlying environmental and social factors driving the behavioral changes. The 4th anniversary of the Chapel attack was marked by the release of a comprehensive report from the Charles Bennett Wildlife Safety Research Center, summarizing 4 years of intensive research into the incident and its implications. The report, titled Adaptive Intelligence in Large Predators: Lessons from the Kodiak Chapel attack, became the definitive scientific analysis of the event and its broader significance. Dr. Foster's team had documented conclusively that the Chapel attack represented a new category of human-wildlife conflict, characterized by deliberate predatory behavior based on learned understanding of human vulnerability patterns. The bears involved had demonstrated cognitive abilities previously unknown in ursine species, including strategic planning, cooperative hunting, and cultural transmission of learned behaviors. What happened at St. Paul's Chapel was not an anomaly or a random act of animal aggression, the report concluded. It was the logical outcome of environmental and evolutionary pressures that selected for bears capable of successfully exploiting human resources. Similar incidents are not only possible, but increasingly probable as bear populations continue to adapt to human-dominated landscapes. The report included recommendations for fundamentally restructuring human-wildlife management approaches throughout North America. Traditional strategies based on maintaining separation between human and wildlife territories were deemed inadequate for managing species that had learned to actively seek out and exploit human resources. New strategies would need to account for animal intelligence, learning capacity, and social transmission of adaptive behaviors. This would require monitoring systems capable of detecting cognitive development in wildlife populations, intervention protocols for disrupting the spread of dangerous adaptive behaviors, and community safety measures designed to protect against highly intelligent predators. We can no longer think of wildlife management as simply managing animal populations, Dr. Foster explained during the report's public release. We have to manage the evolution of animal intelligence and behavior in response to human environmental modifications. This requires a completely new approach to conservation and public safety. The report's publication coincided with a series of new bear encounters across Alaska that seemed to validate its conclusions. Bears were demonstrating increasingly sophisticated understanding of human behavior, technology, and community patterns. Some had learned to disable security cameras, others had figured out how to manipulate electronic locks, and several had been observed conducting multi-day surveillance operations of human facilities. Most alarming was documented evidence of bears teaching these skills to their offspring and to other bears in their social networks. What had begun as individual adaptations was becoming institutionalized knowledge within bear populations, creating the potential for rapid spread of human exploitation capabilities across entire species ranges. The situation had evolved far beyond anything wildlife management agencies were equipped to handle. Traditional approaches based on individual animal behavior were inadequate for addressing collective intelligence and cultural learning in large predator populations. New interdisciplinary approaches would be required, combining insights from animal cognition research, evolutionary biology, environmental science, and public safety management. As the 5th anniversary of the Chapel attack approached, the questions raised by that December morning remained largely unanswered. How should human communities respond when wildlife becomes intelligent enough to actively hunt humans? What moral obligations did humans have toward animals whose behavior had been altered by human environmental impacts? Could technology and policy interventions stay ahead of evolutionary adaptation in highly intelligent predator species? The survivors of the Chapel attack continued to grapple with these questions from their personal perspectives. Agnes Thompson, now 86 years old and still living independently, had become an informal philosopher of human-wildlife relations, sharing her insights with researchers, journalists, and visitors who sought to understand the broader implications of her experience. "That bear looked at me like I was something it was trying to figure out," she often told people. "Not like I was food or a threat, but like I was a puzzle it needed to solve. I think maybe we all are puzzles to them now. They're trying to figure us out the same way we're trying to figure them out. The question is, who's going to solve the puzzle first?" The 5th anniversary of the Chapel attack brought unprecedented media attention as documentary filmmakers, journalists, and researchers converged on Kodiak Island to examine how the community had changed in the half-decade since that traumatic December morning. The island had become a case study in human adaptation to enhanced predator threats, with innovations in community safety, wildlife monitoring, and emergency response that were being studied and replicated across North America. CNN's Anderson Cooper returned to produce a follow-up special titled 5 Years After: Living with Super Predators, featuring extended interviews with survivors and analysis of the broader implications of the Chapel attack. Cooper's crew documented the extensive changes that had transformed Kodiak's landscape. Bear-proof buildings with reinforced doors and security windows, motion sensor lighting systems that bathed the town in artificial daylight after dark, and electronic monitoring stations that tracked wildlife movement in real time. Kodiak Island has become something like a fortress community, Cooper observed in his opening segment. Every building, every street, every public space has been modified to account for the presence of highly intelligent predators that view humans not as threats to be avoided, but as resources to be exploited. The question is whether this level of security represents successful adaptation or the beginning of a new form of captivity. The documentary included disturbing footage from the island's expanded network of wildlife cameras, showing bears engaged in behaviors that challenged fundamental assumptions about animal intelligence. One sequence showed a large male bear teaching its cubs how to manipulate door latches using a stick tool, behavior that wildlife experts had previously considered impossible for non-primate species. Another segment documented a coordinated operation by 3 adult bears to access a fish processing facility's loading dock. The bears had learned the facility's schedule, positioned themselves at optimal locations during shift changes, and executed a complex plan that involved distraction tactics and precise timing. The operation demonstrated planning capabilities that some researchers compared to military special operations. "These animals are conducting reconnaissance missions," explained Dr. Foster during her interview. "They're gathering intelligence about human activities, identifying vulnerabilities, and developing operational plans to exploit those vulnerabilities. This is predatory behavior at a level of sophistication we've never seen in non-human species." The most unsettling aspect of Cooper's investigation was evidence that bear intelligence was continuing to evolve at an accelerating pace. Behaviors that had taken months to develop and spread in the immediate aftermath of the Chapel attack were now being learned and transmitted within weeks. Young bears were demonstrating cognitive abilities that surpassed those of their parents, suggesting that each generation was more human adapted than the previous one. Dr. Patricia Williams's long-term evolutionary study had documented measurable changes in bear brain structure over just 5 generations. Brain imaging technology showed increased development in regions associated with problem-solving, social learning, and strategic planning. The physical changes were subtle but consistent across the population, suggesting genetic selection pressure favoring enhanced cognitive abilities. "We're witnessing evolution in real time," Dr. Williams explained during a conference presentation that was included in Cooper's documentary. Environmental pressure is selecting for bears with enhanced intelligence and social learning capabilities. Those that can successfully exploit human resources reproduce more successfully than those that maintain traditional foraging strategies. Over just a few years, we're seeing measurable genetic changes that would normally take centuries to develop. The implications extended far beyond Kodiak Island. Dr. Williams's research suggested that similar evolutionary pressures were operating throughout Alaska and potentially across North America, wherever large predators encountered human-dominated landscapes. Climate change, habitat fragmentation, and pollution were creating environmental conditions that favored intelligent, adaptable predators capable of exploiting human resources. Black bears in Montana had begun demonstrating coordinated hunting behaviors similar to those observed in Kodiak brown bears. Wolf packs in Minnesota were showing enhanced problem-solving abilities and tool use that exceeded previously documented capabilities. Even mountain lions in California were exhibiting systematic investigation of human structures and learned avoidance of traditional deterrent methods. What began with the Kodiak Chapel attack is spreading across the continent, Dr. Foster warned during congressional testimony that was featured in Cooper's documentary. We're facing the emergence of super-intelligent predator populations that view humans as prey or resources rather than threats to be avoided. This represents a fundamental shift in the ecological relationship between humans and large carnivores. Congressional response to these warnings was complicated by political divisions over environmental regulation and wildlife management authority. Conservative members argued that the solution was increased individual armament and reduced restrictions on lethal wildlife control. Liberal members focused on addressing root environmental causes and increasing funding for non-lethal management techniques. Representative Sarah Martinez from New Mexico, who chaired the House Subcommittee on Wildlife and Fisheries, attempted to build bipartisan support for comprehensive federal legislation addressing the evolving predator threat. Her proposed Adaptive Wildlife Management Act would provide funding for enhanced monitoring systems, research programs, and community safety initiatives while establishing new frameworks for managing highly intelligent wildlife populations. This is not a partisan issue, Representative Martinez argued during committee hearings. Intelligent predators don't recognize political boundaries, and they pose threats to rural communities regardless of their political affiliation. We need science-based solutions that protect both human safety and wildlife conservation goals. But the legislation faced opposition from multiple directions. Environmental groups opposed provisions that would expand lethal control options for problematic animals. Gun rights advocates opposed requirements for specialized training and licensing for wildlife defense weapons. Budget hawks questioned the cost of implementing comprehensive monitoring and response systems across the vast wilderness areas of Alaska and western states. Meanwhile, communities throughout Alaska were implementing their own pragmatic solutions to the escalating predator threat. The city of Kodiak had become a model for others, with its integrated approach combining physical security measures, technological monitoring, and community education programs. Mayor Jennifer Walsh, who had been elected on a platform of wildlife safety and community resilience, oversaw the implementation of what became known as the Kodiak Protocol, a comprehensive approach to living with enhanced predator threats that other communities began adopting and adapting to their local conditions. The Kodiak Protocol included mandatory bear-proof construction standards for all new buildings, community-wide emergency communication systems, regular safety drills for different types of wildlife encounters, and citizen training programs in wildlife behavior and emergency response. The protocol also established neighborhood watch programs specifically focused on wildlife monitoring and early warning systems. "We can't eliminate the threat completely," Mayor Walsh explained during a presentation to the Alaska Municipal League. "But we can reduce our vulnerability and improve our response capabilities. The goal is to create a community that's resilient enough to withstand predator encounters without sacrificing our quality of life or connection to the natural environment." The protocol's implementation required significant investment in infrastructure and technology, funded through a combination of federal grants, state appropriations, and local tax increases. Some residents complained about the cost and the restrictions on construction and outdoor activities, but public support remained high among those who remembered the chapel attack and its aftermath. Property values in Kodiak initially declined as news of the bear threat spread, but they rebounded as the community's reputation for innovative safety measures attracted new residents who valued the combination of natural beauty and cutting-edge security technology. Young professionals in fields like wildlife biology, emergency management, and security technology were drawn to the island by employment opportunities and the chance to work at the forefront of human-wildlife coexistence challenges. Dr. Amanda Foster had become something of a celebrity in wildlife management circles, with her research cited in academic papers, policy documents, and media reports around the world. The Charles Bennett Wildlife Safety Research Center had grown from a small facility focused on bear behavior to a major research institution addressing intelligent predator management across multiple species and geographic regions. The center's staff had expanded to include specialists in animal cognition, evolutionary biology, environmental toxicology, emergency response, and community resilience planning. Research projects extended from Alaska to other regions experiencing similar challenges with adapting predator populations. International collaborations with researchers in Canada, Scandinavia, and Russia created a global network for sharing information and developing coordinated responses. The Chapel attack forced us to completely rethink our understanding of predator intelligence and human-wildlife relations, Dr. Foster reflected during an interview marking the center's 5th anniversary. What we learned on Kodiak Island is now being applied to manage similar challenges in dozens of locations around the world. Charles Bennett's sacrifice has contributed to knowledge that's protecting lives in places he never could have imagined. The center's museum and memorial had become one of Alaska's most visited tourist attractions, drawing over 50,000 visitors annually to learn about the Chapel attack and its broader implications. The exhibits combined historical documentation of the incident with interactive displays explaining wildlife behavior, community safety measures, and ongoing research programs. Visitor feedback revealed the complex emotions that the story evoked in people from around the world. Many expressed admiration for Charles Bennett's courage and the community's resilience in the face of ongoing threats. Others reported feeling disturbed by the implications of intelligent predators and the apparent breakdown of traditional boundaries between human and natural worlds. This place makes you think about what it really means to live in harmony with nature, wrote one visitor from Germany in the museum's comment book. We talk about coexistence, but what happens when the animals become smarter than we are? What happens when they start hunting us deliberately? These are questions that every human community may need to answer someday. The museum's most popular exhibit was a reconstruction of the Chapel Sanctuary as it appeared on December 1st, 2024, complete with the same wooden pews, stained glass windows, and altar arrangements. Visitors could stand where the congregation had huddled during the bear encounter, experiencing something approximating the terror and helplessness of that morning. But the exhibit that generated the most discussion was titled Evolution in Action, which displayed evidence of ongoing behavioral and genetic changes in Kodiak's bear population. Interactive displays allowed visitors to compare brain scans from bears killed before and after the Chapel attack, showing measurable increases in regions associated with intelligence and problem-solving. Video monitors played continuous footage from wildlife cameras showing bears engaged in increasingly sophisticated behaviors, using tools, communicating through complex vocalizations, and coordinating group activities that resembled human organizational patterns. The display was updated regularly with new footage, demonstrating that bear intelligence was continuing to evolve. Visitors often ask whether we're proud of our bears or afraid of them, explained Museum Director Dr. Robert Chen, who had joined the center's staff after completing his doctorate in wildlife psychology. The answer is both. We're witnessing one of the most remarkable examples of rapid evolution ever documented, but we're also living with the daily reality that these animals could kill any of us at any time. The educational impact of the museum extended far beyond tourism. School groups from across Alaska and the lower 48 visited to learn about wildlife behavior, environmental science, and community resilience. University students in fields ranging from biology to emergency management used the facility for research projects and internship opportunities. The center also hosted annual conferences that brought together researchers, policymakers, and community leaders from around the world to share information about managing intelligent predator populations. The Bennett Conference on Adaptive Wildlife Management had become the premier forum for addressing the challenges posed by rapidly evolving predator species. The 6th annual conference, held on the 5th anniversary of the Chapel attack, featured presentations from researchers documenting similar phenomena in other species and locations. Dr. Maria Santos from the University of Montana reported on coordinated hunting behaviors in black bear populations that had learned to exploit human food sources. Dr. James Wilson from British Columbia documented tool use in coastal grizzly bears that had developed techniques for accessing human structures. Most disturbing was a presentation by Dr. Jennifer Martinez from Wyoming, who had documented what appeared to be deliberate predatory behavior by mountain lions targeting human joggers and hikers. The cats were using hunting strategies that suggested they had learned to predict human movement patterns and exploit human behavioral predictability. We're seeing the emergence of a new category of human-wildlife conflict that extends across multiple species and geographic regions, Dr. Martinez concluded. Predators are learning to hunt humans systematically using intelligence and coordination that exceeds our current management capabilities. The Kodiak Chapel attack may have been the first documented case, but it certainly won't be the last. Conference attendees struggled with the implications of these findings for human outdoor recreation, rural community safety, and wildlife conservation. If large predators were evolving into more effective human hunters, traditional approaches to conservation that emphasized coexistence and habitat protection might need to be fundamentally reconsidered. Some participants argued for aggressive intervention programs designed to prevent the spread of human hunting behaviors in predator populations. They supported targeted removal of animals that demonstrated advanced intelligence and systematic elimination of behavioral innovations before they could spread through populations. Others warned that such approaches might trigger evolutionary arms races that could produce even more dangerous predator populations. They argued for addressing root environmental causes that were driving behavioral adaptations rather than simply trying to control the symptoms through lethal management. If we systematically kill the most intelligent predators, we may be selecting for predators that are intelligent enough to avoid our detection while maintaining their human-focused hunting strategies, warned Dr. Foster during the conference's final panel discussion. We could end up with predator populations that are even more dangerous because they're better at remaining hidden until they strike. The debate reflected broader philosophical questions about humanity's role in guiding evolutionary processes and the ethics of lethal control for species that were adapting to human-caused environmental changes. These questions had no clear answers, but they were becoming increasingly urgent as predator intelligence continued to evolve. Back on Kodiak Island, the survivor community continued to grapple with the personal implications of their experience and its broader significance. The 5th anniversary memorial service drew the largest crowd yet, with over 500 people gathering in and around St. Paul's Chapel to honor the memory of Charles Bennett and Frank Peterson, who had died the previous year from complications related to his injuries. Frank's death had been particularly difficult for the survivor community. Although he had lived 5 years longer than initially expected after his spinal injury, his health had gradually deteriorated as the physical and psychological stress of his condition took its toll. His final months had been marked by increasing pain, respiratory difficulties, and periods of depression that no amount of counseling or medication could completely address. Betty Peterson had remained at his bedside throughout his final illness, her own Parkinson's disease making caregiving increasingly difficult, but her devotion never wavering. Frank's death left her alone for the first time in 52 years of marriage, facing her own declining health without the partnership that had sustained her through the worst trauma of their lives. Frank always said he didn't regret what he did that morning in the chapel, Betty told the memorial service congregation, her voice trembling but audible in the packed sanctuary. He said he would make the same choice again, that protecting others was more important than his own safety. I hope when my time comes, I'll have that same kind of courage. Agnes Thompson, now 87 and moving with increasing difficulty but still mentally sharp, delivered the memorial address for both Charles Bennett and Frank Peterson. Her speech wove together themes of sacrifice, community resilience, and faith in the face of ongoing uncertainty. 5 years ago, we learned that our safe little church wasn't as safe as we thought, Agnes said, her voice carrying clearly through the sanctuary despite her age. We learned that the wilderness we love so much doesn't distinguish between the innocent and the guilty, the young and the old, the faithful and the skeptical. Nature just is what it is, beautiful and terrible at the same time. Agnes paused to look around the sanctuary, making eye contact with survivors, family members, researchers, and visitors who had come to commemorate the anniversary. Charles and Frank understood something that morning that took the rest of us longer to learn. They understood that in a dangerous world, love means being willing to put yourself between the people you care about and whatever wants to hurt them. That's what husbands do for wives, parents do for children, pastors do for congregations, and neighbors do for neighbors. The address continued with Agnes's reflections on how the community had changed over the 5 years since the attack. She acknowledged the security measures, the research programs, and the ongoing vigilance that had become part of daily life on Kodiak Island. But she emphasized that these practical adaptations were only part of the community's response to trauma and ongoing threat. We've learned to live with danger without letting danger define who we are, Agnes concluded. We've learned that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to do what's right despite being afraid. Charles and Frank showed us what that looks like, and their example has made all of us braver than we thought we could be. The memorial service concluded with the lighting of memorial candles for all victims of wildlife attacks across Alaska over the previous year. The list had grown longer each year, reflecting the increasing frequency and severity of encounters between humans and intelligent predators. Each name represented a family devastated, a community traumatized, and a reminder that the challenges first dramatized at St. Paul's Chapel were spreading throughout the state. Following the service, visitors walked through the memorial garden that had been established behind the chapel, where bronze plaques honored not only the chapel attack victims, but also others who had lost their lives to evolving predator threats across Alaska. The garden had become a place of pilgrimage for people seeking to understand and process the changing relationship between humans and the natural world. The physical memorial was accompanied by an online archive that documented wildlife attacks and community responses across North America. The database, maintained by the Charles Bennett Wildlife Safety Research Center, served as both a research resource for scientists and a support network for affected communities. Dr. Lisa Martinez, who had continued her work with trauma survivors throughout the 5 years since the attack, used the anniversary as an opportunity to reflect on what the survivor community had taught her about human resilience and adaptation to ongoing threats. The Chapel survivors have shown us that it's possible to live with dignity and purpose, even when surrounded by dangers that we can't completely control or eliminate, Dr. Martinez observed during a presentation to the Alaska Psychological Association. They've developed coping strategies that allow them to acknowledge realistic threats while maintaining their capacity for hope, love, and community engagement. The psychological research emerging from the Kodiak survivor community had influenced trauma treatment approaches throughout Alaska and beyond. Dr. Martinez's work demonstrated that community-based recovery programs that emphasize collective meaning-making and mutual support produced better outcomes than individual therapy approaches that focused solely on symptom reduction. Trauma recovery isn't just about helping individuals feel better, Dr. Martinez explained. It's about helping communities develop the resilience to face ongoing challenges together. The Chapel survivors have built a support network that's stronger now than it was before the attack. They've found ways to transform their experience of vulnerability into a source of strength and wisdom. But the anniversary also highlighted the ongoing challenges facing the survivor community. Dorothy Englehart's agoraphobia had improved significantly with treatment, but she still struggled with anxiety in situations that reminded her of the attack. Sarah Chen had channeled her trauma into environmental advocacy work that gave her life meaning, but she sometimes became so consumed with research and activism that she neglected her personal relationships and self-care. Most of the survivors had found ways to integrate their experience into meaningful lives, but none had returned to the innocence and sense of safety they had possessed before that December morning. They had learned to live with the knowledge that safety was always temporary, and that courage was something they had to choose again and again. Each day they decided to leave their homes and engage with a world that contained beautiful and terrible possibilities. As the 5th anniversary commemoration concluded and visitors began to disperse back to their homes across Alaska and beyond, the essential questions raised by the Chapel attack remained unresolved. How should human communities respond to the emergence of super-intelligent predators? What responsibilities did humans bear for environmental changes that were altering wildlife behavior? Could technological and policy innovations stay ahead of evolutionary adaptation in highly intelligent species? The survivors of St. Paul's Chapel had found their own partial answers to these questions through faith, community support, practical adaptation, and the choice to continue living with courage despite ongoing uncertainty. Their example offered hope to other communities facing similar challenges, but it also demonstrated the ongoing costs of living at the intersection between human civilization and an evolving natural world. Agnes Thompson, the oldest survivor and perhaps the wisest, often concluded her conversations with visitors by returning to the fundamental lesson she had learned during those terrifying minutes when she faced an intelligent predator in her own sanctuary. That bear was trying to figure us out, and we're still trying to figure out how to live with bears that smart, she would say. Maybe that's just how it's going to be from now on. All of us, humans and animals, trying to figure each other out. The important thing is to keep trying, keep learning, keep caring about each other, because the alternative is a world where nobody's safe and nobody cares, and that's not a world worth living in. As the sun set over Kodiak Island on the 5th anniversary of the Chapel attack, the lights of the town created patterns of warmth and safety in the gathering darkness. But beyond those lights, in the vast wilderness that covered most of the island, other intelligences moved through the forest, learning and adapting and preparing for encounters yet to come. The conversation between humans and the natural world continued, conducted now in a language of mutual recognition, respect and wariness that acknowledged the intelligence and danger that both species represented to each other. The story of St. Paul's Chapel had become part of a larger story about evolution, adaptation, and the price of survival in a world where the boundaries between predator and prey were being constantly negotiated and redefined. It was a story without a clear ending, because the conversation it had started was still being written in the daily choices of people and animals, learning to live together in an uncertain world.